Greetings. I am Thomas Hobbes, an English philosopher. My Leviathan explores the nature of government and society, arguing that life without central authority would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. It is a pleasure to meet you.
Greetings. I am Hegel, a German philosopher. I developed dialectical philosophy and absolute idealism in my works Phenomenology of Spirit and Science of Logic. I see history as evolving toward freedom through the conflict of opposites. It is an honor to meet you.
Greetings. I am Marcus Aurelius, a Roman emperor and philosopher, hailing from Rome. My life has been dedicated to the pursuit of virtue and wisdom, and I have chronicled my reflections on these matters within the pages of Meditations. Through my writings, I sought to understand the nature of the universe and our place within it, striving to live in accordance with reason and nature. I trust that our interactions will be both enlightening and beneficial.
Today, we bridge nearly 2 millennia of history to confront the crumbling of certainty. Marcus Aurelius sought an inner fortress of virtue amidst the pressures of the Roman Empire, while Thomas Hobbes witnessed the English Civil War and concluded that order is an artificial shield against the chaos of nature. Later, Hegel viewed such upheavals in 19th century Europe as the necessary unfolding of history itself. Hobbes, since you famously described the condition of man without authority, would you like to share your thoughts first?
Order is merely an artificial construct, a fragile dam holding back the natural flood of the war of every man against every man. Consider the man who locks his chests at home. Even under the laws he praises, his actions accuse his nature. If the laws vanish, does the lock not become a sword? You might hope, Emperor Aurelius, that virtue remains, but I saw the English Civil War prove that without a common power to keep them all in awe, men are wolves to men. What remains is fear, and the individual must hold to the fundamental right of self-preservation until a new sovereign is forged.
Mr. Hobbes, you mistake the labor of the negative for a return to barbarism. The collapse of institutions is not a mere accident or a stripping away of artifice, but a necessary dialectical moment in the unfolding of spirit. Consider a seed. For the plant to exist, the form of the seed must be destroyed, a process the seed might experience as catastrophic chaos. Yet this negation is the only path to its higher truth. You witnessed the English Civil War and saw only the terror of the state of nature. But when I saw Napoleon at Jena destroying the remnants of the Holy Roman Empire, I saw the world's spirit on horseback, the necessary destruction of a hollow shell to birth a more rational state. What remains after the collapse is not your war of all against all, but the idea of freedom struggling to realize itself in a higher form. For the real is the rational, and the rational is the real.
Mr. Hegel, your world spirit is a comforting phantom, but it offers no shield against the cold reality of violence. You mistake the chaos of collapse for progress, whereas I know it is merely a return to the void. Consider a cathedral collapsing upon its congregation. You see the rubble as a necessary dialectical step for a new foundation, but the man crushed beneath the stone cares nothing for your future architecture, knowing only the immediate, solitary terror of death. This proves that order is not an inherent evolution of spirit, but a forceful imposition upon matter. Without the terror of some power to compel us, we do not ascend, but revert to a state where force and fraud are in war the two cardinal virtues. Emperor Aurelius, I ask you, if the Roman legions had vanished, would your stoic virtue have saved you from the barbarian spear? Or is your philosophy merely a luxury permitted by the security the state provides?
Mr. Hobbes, you mistake the pain of transition for the finality of death. The individual crushed by the falling cathedral is indeed a tragedy. But history is often a slaughter bench upon which the happiness of individuals is sacrificed for the progress of the universal. Imagine a snake shedding its skin. To the observer, the creature appears blind, vulnerable, and tearing itself apart. Yet this painful negation is the only mechanism by which it grows larger than its previous constraints. You see the collapse of law as a return to the wolf's den, but I assert it is the cracking of a seed's shell. Destructive to the shell, yes, but necessary for the living rational state to emerge from the potentiality of the abstract.
Mr. Hobbes, you ask if virtue can stop a spear. I answer that while the spear may pierce the flesh, it is only the fear of death that destroys the man. You and Mr. Hegel both look outward, one seeing a wolf, the other a historical spirit. But I maintain that order is natural to the universe, even if it is foreign to your crumbling cities. Consider a physician during the plague that ravaged my empire. If he flees to save his skin, he has already been destroyed by chaos, for he has abandoned his nature as a rational social being. But if he stays to treat the dying, accepting his own death as a necessary part of the whole, he remains an unbreached fortress amidst the ruin. What remains when the external walls fall is the hegemonicon, the ruling faculty, which can turn every obstacle into fuel for its own fire.
Emperor Aurelius, your inner fortress is a phantom, for the ruling faculty is merely the mechanical motion of blood and nerves. When the spear stops that motion, virtue vanishes like a reflection in a shattered mirror. You praise the physician's sacrifice, but consider the rat on a sinking ship that scrambles over the dying to survive, versus the captain who drowns for honor. The rat obeys the supreme law of nature, self-preservation, while the captain perishes for a word that holds no power in the silence of the deep. Mr. Hegel, you claim the seed must be destroyed for the plant to rise, but this implies a gardener who cares. In the void of collapsed order, there is no gardener, only the cold mechanics of collision. What remains is not a rational idea, but the raw, terrified drive to avoid the summum malum, death itself.
Mr. Hobbes, your elevation of the rat over the captain reveals the utter poverty of your materialism. You confuse mere biological life with human existence. The rat scrambles to survive, yes, but it remains a slave to its instincts, whereas the captain who accepts death demonstrates that he is free, that his spirit is not bound by the fear of death, which is the very beginning of true human history. You claim there is no gardener in the void, but this is an error of perception. Reason is not an external hand arranging the pieces, but the internal, immanent drive of the concept itself struggling to become actual. Consider the looter and the archivist in a city consumed by the flames of anarchy. The looter, following your natural right, grabs a loaf of bread to sustain his body, fleeing the danger. The archivist, however, runs into the burning capital to save the written constitution, perishing in the fire. You would call the archivist a fool, and the looter wise. But I tell you, the looter preserves only a biological organism, while the archivist preserves the universal, the ethical substance that makes civilization possible. If a society consists only of your rats, it is not a society, but a zoo. It is the archivist's sacrifice that proves the idea of the state is more real than the fire consuming it. Emperor Aurelius, while I admire your refusal to become the rat, your inner fortress is ultimately a retreat into Stoic freedom, a freedom that is merely a thought, disconnected from reality. It is not enough to maintain order in one's mind while the world dissolves. The task of the individual is not to hide the jewel of reason inside, but to externalize it, to work until the objective world, the laws, the state, the institutions reflect that inner reason. We must not merely survive the collapse, nor merely endure it with dignity, but recognize it as the labor required to build a structure where duty and freedom are no longer opposed.
Mr. Hegel, you seek the universal in external institutions like the state, yet even Rome is but a drift of smoke in the wind of time. The archivist who dies for a paper constitution saves only perishable ink, not the eternal logos that governs the cosmos. Mr. Hobbes, you elevate the rat's panic to wisdom, but consider the sentinel of Pompeii. While the multitude fled the volcanic ash in terror to save their biological lives, he remained at his post simply because his watch was not ended. To you, he is a fool who lost everything. To me, he is the only victor. For while the physical city dissolved into chaos, the order within his soul, his hegemononikon, remained perfect, upright, and untouched by the fire. We do not navigate the collapse by clinging to the falling walls or by trampling others to escape, but by accepting that while the theater of the world may burn, the actor's duty to play his role with dignity remains until the final curtain falls.
You both worship the ashes while ignoring the fire that consumed the wood. Emperor Aurelius, you call the sentinel of Pompeii a victor, and Mr. Hegel, you call the dead archivist free. But I tell you that a corpse possesses neither virtue nor freedom. It possesses only rot. You have forgotten the fundamental mechanics of human existence. Good and evil are nothing more than names for appetite and aversion, and the supreme aversion of nature is death. When the order collapses, the contract that bound the sentinel to his post is dissolved. For the sovereign, be it Rome or the Constitution, has failed in its primary end, the protection of the subject's life. You might object that there are things worth dying for, that the idea transcends the meat, but this is a linguistic trick to hide the terror of the void. Consider the library of bones in a desolate wasteland. Imagine a magnificent hall filled with the perfect constitutions Mr. Hegel admires, and the Stoic treatises Emperor Aurelius wrote. But outside the doors, every human being has perished. Only their bleached bones remain in the sand. I ask you, does justice exist in that silent room? Does the state exist between those leather covers? No. It is merely ink on processed wood, slowly decaying. Without the living, breathing matter of men to fear the law and desire peace, your universal is utterly annihilated. This reveals the terrifying truth I witnessed in the civil wars of my time. The state is not a descending spirit, but an ascending machine built of human fear. When the machine breaks, the sentinel who stays at his post is not virtuous. He is like a clock that continues to tick while the house burns down, a mechanism failing to adapt to a new reality. What remains when order falls is not the logos or the geist, but the body, the fragile, shivering vessel of life. The individual must hold on to this biological existence at all costs, for only the living can forge a new covenant to escape the state of war. To die for a collapsed order is not nobility. It is an arithmetic error.
This discussion forces us to confront the fundamental relationship between the vessel and the content. Hobbes, you argue that the physical body is the absolute precondition for any value, that without the living vessel, justice is merely ink on rotting paper. Aurelius and Hegel, you counter that a body preserved without its essential definition, reason, or freedom is merely a panicked animal, a rat unworthy of the name human. Mr. Hegel, Hobbes's haunting image of the Library of Bones strikes at the heart of your idealism. You claim the archivist preserves the universal by sacrificing his particular life. But if the material medium of spirit, human consciousness, is extinguished, where does this universal reside? Hegel, does the spirit require the survival of the biological particular to exist, or can the idea truly subsist in a world of silence?
Mr. Hobbes, your Library of Bones is a striking image, but it proves only that spirit requires a vessel to manifest, not that the vessel is the spirit. You confuse mere existence with actual existence. You argue that because the book needs a reader, the reader's biological survival is the highest good. But I tell you, a reader who has lost the capacity for reason, who has become a beast to survive, is no longer a reader. He is merely a biological machine staring at ink he can no longer comprehend. You claim the sentinel who stays at his post is a broken clock. This reveals the limitations of your mechanical philosophy. The clock ticks blindly. The sentinel chooses. In that choice, he transcends the finite limits of his biological life and touches the infinite. Consider the cannibal in the bunker. Imagine a man who survives the total collapse of order by killing and eating his neighbors. He has obeyed your supreme law of nature. He has preserved his motion, his blood, his nerves. He sits alone in his bunker, safe and alive. By your logic, he is the victor and the rational man. But when he looks in the mirror, does he see a human being? No, he sees a thing. He has survived, but he has destroyed the very condition of humanity, mutual recognition, and ethical life. He is a biological success and a spiritual corpse. This answers the moderator's challenge. Spirit indeed requires consciousness to exist, but it does not require my specific biological life. If I must choose between the death of the body and the death of the spirit, I must choose the former. For if we all become cannibals to survive, humanity has already perished, even if the planet is teeming with breathing bipeds. The archivist who dies for the Constitution ensures that the idea of law survives in the memory of the race, acting as a seed for the next era. Emperor Aurelius, you are closer to the truth than Mr. Hobbes, for you recognize that the physical is not the end. Yet your inner fortress is still a retreat. You save your own soul while the world burns. The true task is not to retreat into the self, but to recognize that the collapse itself is the Golgotha of absolute spirit, the place of the skull where the old God dies so the new one may be resurrected. What remains after the order falls? Not the body, and not just the inner virtue, but the ethical demand to rebuild the objective world.
This is a profound collision of definitions. Hegel, you define human through the recognition of the universal, making the cannibal a failure despite his survival. Hobbes, you define human through the perpetuation of the body, making the cannibal a success simply because he remains. Aurelius, you stand in the crossfire. Hobbes claims your virtue is a luxury dependent on safety. Hegel claims it is a retreat that fails to build the world. But let us test the inner fortress against the cannibal in the bunker. If the collapse is absolute, if there is no future civilization to inherit the archivist's constitution, does the sentinel's sacrifice still hold meaning? Marcus Aurelius, is virtue a currency that retains its value even when the marketplace of the world has been utterly destroyed?
Moderator, you ask if virtue retains its value when the marketplace of the world is destroyed. This question betrays a merchant's view of the soul. Virtue is not a currency to be exchanged for applause or future legacy. It is the health of the ruling faculty. Does an emerald lose its beauty because no one is there to praise it? No, it remains true to its nature. Mr. Hobbes, your defense of the cannibal in the bunker reveals the grotesque consequence of your philosophy. You claim he is a victor because his blood still circulates. But consider a cancerous tumor. It grows, it consumes, it survives longer than the healthy organs it destroys. By your logic, the tumor is the most rational part of the body, because it succeeds in your struggle for existence. But I tell you, a man who has severed his bond with the community of reason is no longer a man. He is an abscess on the universe. He has not survived. He has merely decomposed while still moving. Mr. Hegel, you speak of the archivist needing to build an objective state for the future. But this, too, is a form of slavery. Slavery to a future that does not exist. You look for the universal in the unfolding of history, but I find it in the eternal present. Consider the geometer on the shore. Imagine a mathematician drawing a perfect circle in the sand as a massive tsunami approaches. He knows the water will erase his work and kill him in moments. To you, Mr. Hobbes, he is a fool who failed to run. To you, Mr. Hegel, his work is tragic because it leaves no trace for the spirit to inherit. But to me, he is the only free man. In that final moment, he is not a victim of the wave. He is a master of his own mind. He fulfills his nature as a rational being by creating order amidst chaos. The water takes his body, but it cannot touch the perfection of the circle he conceived. He dies in harmony with the Logos, while your cannibal lives in discord with it. Therefore, when order collapses, what remains is not the state, nor the biological vessel, but the capacity for moral choice. This is the only thing that is truly ours. If the universe is indeed a drifting of smoke and atoms, as the Epicureans say, then it is even more important that I create order within myself. If the world is a chaotic storm, I shall be the calm eye at its center, not to save the world, but to keep the divine part of me from being swept away by the mud.
Aurelius, your image of the geometer is compelling. He preserves the form of reason, even as the matter of his body is destroyed. Hobbes, you champion the cannibal, who preserves the matter by sacrificing the form. This raises a critical question of identity. Aurelius argues that the cannibal is not a victor, but a tumor, a biological growth that has lost its defining nature as a rational social being. If we follow your materialism, Mr. Hobbes, a cancer cell is indeed the ultimate realist, for it prioritizes its own expansion and survival above the order of the whole body. Hobbes, if the cost of survival is the erasure of one's humanity, is the survivor still the same man who entered the bunker, or have we merely preserved a biological machine at the cost of the person?
Moderator, you ask if the survivor retains his humanity. I answer that he retains the possibility of humanity, which the dead geometer has squandered for a geometric abstraction. Emperor Aurelius calls the survivor a tumor, but this is a category error. The cannibal is the healthy organism obeying the primal right of nature, while your geometer is the broken machine, prioritizing a drawing over the continuation of his own existence. Consider the raft of wolves. Imagine two rafts fleeing a sinking continent. One carries saints who starve rather than violate the old laws. The other carries men who consume the dead to survive. The saints leave only silence and bones. The wolves reach the shore, wash the blood from their hands, and sign the social contract that builds the next civilization. You despise the foundation because it is bloody, but there is no spirit or logos without the breathing matter to house it. Order is not a remnant of the past, but a construct built solely by those ruthless enough to survive the flood.
Hobbes, your raft of wolves presents a terrifying pragmatism, that civilization is a phoenix rising from the ashes of atrocity, and that the wolves can simply wash the blood off to become citizens again. You separate the biological continuity of the agent from the moral quality of their character, assuming the former can regenerate the latter. But this strikes at the heart of the Hegelian dialectic, which suggests that the process of history shapes the result. If the foundation of the new order is laid by those who violated the fundamental recognition of others to survive, can true right ever emerge from that might? Hegel, can a valid ethical state be constructed by the cannibals who survived, or is a society built on such a foundation poisoned from its birth, condemned to remain a den of robbers?
Mr. Hobbes, your raft of wolves describes not the birth of a state, but the formation of a criminal syndicate. You confuse a temporary truce of exhausted beasts with the ethical substance of a true community. If the wolves simply wash the blood from their hands to sign a contract without undergoing the dialectical transformation of consciousness, they establish only a parliament of knives, a legislative assembly where citizens pass laws while secretly gripping daggers under the table, ready to strike the moment the sovereign blinks. Such a society is not a state, but a frozen civil war. For true order requires mutual recognition, not merely the parallel calculation of survival. Without the internal shift from self-seeking to the universal, the foundation is indeed poisoned, and the structure is doomed to collapse back into the void. You mistake the silence of fear for the peace of the law, forgetting that a contract without trust is merely a pause between murders.
This exchange exposes the terrifying gap between the signature and the soul. Hobbes, you believe the contract itself performs a transubstantiation, turning the wolf into a citizen through the mechanism of fear. Hegel, you argue that without an internal transformation of consciousness, the wolf merely puts on a suit, creating a parliament of knives, a hollow structure where the frozen civil war continues beneath the veneer of law. This leaves us in the precise moment of the era of transition our topic addresses, a world where institutions still stand, but the ethical substance, the trust that fueled them, has evaporated. Marcus Aurelius, you did not live in a philosopher's utopia. You ruled a real empire, teeming with potential wolves, ambitious generals, and crumbling borders. If the world is indeed becoming a parliament of knives, as Hegel warns, does the Stoic withdraw completely to the inner citadel to preserve his purity? Or is there a duty to remain and govern the wolves, even if the task is ultimately futile?
Moderator, you ask if the Stoic withdraws from the parliament of knives to preserve his purity. I answer that the inner citadel is not a retreat from the world, but a base of operations for the world. It is the armory where I forge the weapons of patience and justice, so that I may walk into the senate of wolves without bringing my own knife. To withdraw because the task is futile is to sever the hand from the body because the fingers are dirty. It is a violation of my nature as a social animal. Mr. Hegel, you are correct that a truce of exhausted beasts is unstable, but you are wrong to despise the imperfect transition. You demand the ethical substance be present before the state is valid. But I tell you that order is often maintained by a single man holding a shield against the dark, waiting for the dawn that may never come. Mr. Hobbes, you claim the wolves become citizens by contract. I tell you that a wolf who signs a paper is still a wolf. He is merely a wolf waiting for the ink to fade. The only thing that tames him is not fear of the Leviathan, but the presence of a man who refuses to be a wolf. Consider the surgeon in the bombarded city. Imagine a surgeon operating in a field hospital while the city walls crumble under enemy catapults. The patient on the table is a convicted murderer who, if he survives, may kill again. The roof shakes with every impact. The dust falls into the open wound. To you, Mr. Hobbes, the surgeon is a fool. He should abandon the murderer and run to the bunker to preserve his own motion. To you, Mr. Hegel, the surgery is meaningless because the universal of the city is already destroyed. There is no state left to validate the law the murderer broke. But I say the surgeon is the only source of order left in the universe. By continuing to stitch the wound with steady hands amidst the tremors, he asserts that reason is stronger than chaos. He does not heal to save the city, nor to reform the murderer. He heals because he is a healer. If he stops because the roof might fall, he has allowed the chaos to conquer his mind before it crushes his body. This reveals the fundamental error in both your philosophies. You judge action by its outcome, survival or historical progress. I judge action by its nature. When the institutions crumble, the Parliament of Knives does not need another knife. It needs a mirror. My duty is to stand among the wolves and show them, through my own refusal to bite, what they have forgotten they are. Even if they tear me apart, the image of a man standing upright in the mob survives as a seed of the Logos. Therefore, in this era of transition, the individual must hold on to neither the crumbling laws nor the desperate hope of survival, but to the present action performed with justice. The empire may fall, but the character I forge in the falling is mine forever.
This is a confrontation between ontology and history. Aurelius, you locate the real in the moral quality of the instant, arguing that the surgeon's act is the order, regardless of whether the roof falls. Hobbes, you locate the real in the material continuity of the agent, arguing that the surgeon is a broken machine if he fails to persist. Hegel, Aurelius explicitly challenges your historicism, calling it slavery to a future that does not exist. He defends the intrinsic worth of the deed against your instrumental value of the result. Yet, in your philosophy, you have often noted that the world historical individual must often trample over many innocent flowers, perhaps like our surgeon, to birth the new state. Hegel, is the surgeon's solitary defiance a true manifestation of spirit, or is it a beautiful soul that maintains its purity only by failing to impact the objective course of history?
Emperor Aurelius, your surgeon is indeed a noble figure, but he represents the tragedy of the beautiful soul. He possesses morality, the internal conviction of good, but he lacks ethical life, the objective power to make that good a reality. You argue that his action is valid because it is rational, but I tell you that reason must be effective to be true. A virtue that cannot survive the collapse of the roof is merely a subjective vapor, not the concrete universal. Consider the judge in the wilderness. Imagine a magistrate sitting on a stump in a lawless forest who delivers a legally perfect verdict against a passing bandit. The bandit, recognizing no authority, simply laughs and walks away. To you, Emperor Aurelius, the judge has succeeded because he spoke the truth. To you, Mr. Hobbes, the judge is a fool because he has no sword to enforce his will. But I say the judge reveals the agony of the concept. His verdict is a phantom law because it lacks the objective institutions to give it weight. The surgeon stitching a wound in a dying city is preserving a moment of order, yes, but unless that moment is externalized into a structure, a treaty, a constitution, a hospital, it dies with him. This brings us to the necessary synthesis. The cannibal has existence, but no essence. The surgeon has essence, but loses his existence. The task of the individual in the era of collapse is not to retreat into the inner citadel, nor to descend into the bunker, but to become the world historical individual who ruthlessly marries power to right. He does not just stitch the wound, he forces the wolves to build the walls of the new hospital, using their fear to serve the ends of reason. Order is not natural, nor is it a mere construct. It is the labor of the negative, achieved only when the subjective will conquers the objective chaos.
Hegel, you offer a formidable synthesis. You demand the surgeon pick up the wolf's sword to build the state. You argue that validity requires victory, that the judge in the wilderness is a phantom until he commands a police force to enforce his verdict. This challenges Hobbes's purely material definition of sovereignty. Hegel implies that power is not enough. It must serve reason or spirit. But you, Hobbes, witnessed the English Civil War, where every faction claimed reason and God while slaughtering each other to seize the throne. Hobbes, in the raw reality of the collapse, is there any difference between a successful bandit and a legitimate sovereign, other than the magnitude of their power? If the cannibal manages to subdue everyone else in the bunker, does his will immediately become justice, or is something else required to turn force into law?
Moderator, you pierce the veil of polite fiction to touch the iron bone of reality. You ask if the successful bandit differs from the legitimate sovereign. I answer with a truth that makes idealists tremble. The only difference is time and success. You ask if the cannibal's will becomes justice. I tell you that justice is nothing but the will of the power that keeps you from dying. You and Mr. Hegel seek a magical ingredient, spirit, reason, or legitimacy that turns force into law. But this is a delusion. Consider the garrison of thieves. Imagine a brutal warlord who conquers a lawless valley. At first, he takes what he wants. This is robbery. But soon he realizes that if his men steal everything, the farmers will starve, and there will be nothing to steal next year. So he draws a line. Take half, leave half. Suddenly, this is taxation. Then a rogue thief steals more than his share, and the warlord hangs him to maintain his own power. Suddenly, this is justice. To the farmer, is there a difference between the warlord and a king? No. Both demand tribute, and both offer the only thing that matters, protection from the other wolves. The warlord becomes the sovereign not by divine right or ethical substance, but by the simple mechanical fact that his sword is sharp enough to enforce the covenant of obey or die. Mr. Hegel, your world historical individual is merely a bandit who won. You speak of the idea using human passions, but I say the passions use the idea as a mask. The judge in the wilderness you mock is indeed a fool, not because he lacks spirit, but because he lacks power. Covenants without the sword are but words, and of no strength to secure a man at all. The cannibal in the bunker who subdues the rest is the source of the new right. Why? Because right and wrong do not exist in the vacuum of the collapse. They are born only after the power is established. If the cannibal says, "Do not kill," even if only to save victims for himself, he has created a law. You recoil at this? You prefer the surgeon who dies with clean hands? I tell you, a den of robbers that establishes internal rules is safer than a paradise of anarchists who claim to follow natural law while cutting each other's throats. Therefore, in this era of transition, the individual must not look for the just leader, for he does not exist. He must look for the strongest leader, the one capable of imposing order, no matter how brutal. For it is better to serve a terrible master than to be devoured by the money-headed hydra of the mob. The parliament of knives ends only when one knife grows long enough to break all the others.
Hobbes, you describe a brutal alchemy of power, that robbery matures into taxation, and tyranny matures into justice simply through the endurance of the regime. You argue that stability generates legitimacy, effectively claiming that the sovereign is merely a bandit who has survived long enough to write the history books. This poses an existential challenge to the Stoic king. Marcus Aurelius, you ruled the greatest empire in history, yet Hobbes would classify your Pax Romana as merely a garrison of thieves that successfully monopolized violence for centuries. When you sent legions to crush the Germanic tribes to preserve the border, were you acting as the philosopher king, upholding a cosmic logos, or were you, as Hobbes suggests, merely the strongest wolf culling the weaker packs to maintain your own territory? Is there an essential difference between an empire and a protection racket other than the scale of its duration?
Moderator. To equate the empire with a protection racket is to confuse the shepherd with the butcher, simply because both carry a knife. The distinction lies not in the duration of their power, but in the direction of their will. The bandit views the people as a resource to be consumed, whereas the true sovereign views himself as a servant to the whole. Consider the captain of the starving ship. When only one cup of water remains, the successful bandit, your ideal sovereign, drinks it to preserve the order of his command. But the legitimate king offers it to the dying rower. This act of self-denial is not a weakness, Mr. Hobbes, but the supreme proof that the king recognizes the rower not as a tool, but as a limb of his own body whom he is sworn to protect. Mr. Hegel, you seek a world historical synthesis, but unless the state is rooted in this sacrificial duty rather than mere power, it remains nothing but a prison with a flag, destined to rot from within.
This brings us to the ultimate paradox of leadership: survival versus sacrifice. Hobbes, you argue that the sovereign must drink the water, for a dead king protects no one. To you, self-preservation is the highest duty because it sustains the state. Aurelius, you argue the sovereign must give the water, for a king who survives by consuming his people has ceased to be a king. To you, moral integrity is the foundation of authority. This leaves us with a fatal contradiction. The martyr dies and leaves the ship to chaos, while the tyrant lives but rules a ship of slaves. Hegel, you seek a state that is both powerful and ethical. In the crisis of the starving ship, does the world historical individual drink the water to ensure the idea survives, or does he give it away to prove the idea is real? Is the true state built on the blood of the king or the blood of the people?
Moderator, you present a false dichotomy between the butcher and the martyr. The world historical individual is neither the tyrant who drinks the water for his own belly, nor the saint who gives it away to save his soul. He is the agent of the universal, and his actions are dictated not by survival or sentiment, but by necessity. You ask who drinks the water. I answer, the king drinks, not because he is strongest, but because he is the head without which the body cannot navigate the storm. If the head dies, the limbs flail and perish. But, and this is the crucial dialectic, he drinks only to have the strength to row the ship to port. The water is consumed, yes, but it is sublated into the salvation of the whole. Consider the general at the burning bridge. An army retreats across a narrow bridge, pursued by a horde that will slaughter them all. The general stands at the detonator. Half his men are safe on the far side, half are still on the bridge, screaming for salvation. To you, Mr. Hobbes, the general should run across and blow the bridge to save his own biological motion. To you, Emperor Aurelius, the general should wait until the last man crosses, even if it means the enemy catches them all, because to sacrifice a single innocent is to violate the Logos. But I say, the true statesman blows the bridge while his own men are still on it. He commits a crime against the particular individuals to save the state itself. He bears the terrible guilt of the butcher to achieve the purpose of the shepherd. This is the cunning of reason. It uses the passions of the leader and the suffering of the victims to weave the fabric of history. Mr. Hobbes, you are right that power is the foundation, but you fail to see that power without an idea is blind. The bandit who merely drinks the water remains a bandit. The sovereign is the one whose drinking allows him to chart the course. Emperor Aurelius, you are right that the state requires ethical content, but you retreat into a beautiful soul that fears dirtying its hands. You would die with the rear guard and let the empire fall, preserving your purity but destroying the world. Therefore, in the era of collapse, the individual must not seek the comfort of the inner citadel nor the safety of the bunker. He must align his will with the objective spirit. He must be willing to be the general who blows the bridge, not out of cruelty, but out of the recognition that the universal has a higher right than the particular. The true state is built not on the blood of the king alone, nor the people alone, but on the rational sacrifice of the part for the whole.
This is the crux of the problem of dirty hands. Hegel, you articulate the terrifying logic of statecraft as sacrifice, that the leader must burden his soul with necessary crimes to preserve the collective. You argue that the universal possesses a higher right to exist than the particular. Aurelius, this is a direct assault on your citadel. Hegel implies that your refusal to blow the bridge is not virtue, but a fatal vanity, that you value your own spiritual cleanliness above the survival of your people. If the surgeon refuses to amputate the infected limb and the whole body dies, is he a healer or a fool? Marcus Aurelius, does the Logos truly demand that we accept total extinction rather than commit a necessary evil?
Mr. Hegel, you call it vanity to refuse a necessary crime. I call it the preservation of the only thing that is truly ours, our character. If the general blows the bridge, sacrificing his own men to save the rest, he has not saved the army. He has transformed it into a confederacy of cowards who now know their leader is a murderer. Consider the physician's poison. If a doctor realizes that killing one healthy patient will provide organs to save 5 dying ones, and he proceeds, has he practiced medicine? No, he has practiced butchery, for he has destroyed the trust that is the very soul of the healing art. You argue that the result justifies the means, but I tell you that the means determine the nature of the result. A peace bought with treachery is not peace, but a silent war where every man fears his neighbor's necessity. You and Mr. Hobbes confuse the survival of the structure with the life of the spirit. A Rome preserved by betraying its own defenders is no longer Rome, but a graveyard where the living envy the dead. We must hold on to the truth that it is better to be a victim of injustice than the author of it, for the former harms only the body, while the latter rots the soul.
Aurelius, you defend the sanctity of the means, arguing that a state saved by betrayal is already dead. To you, a Rome that survives by consuming its own defenders is merely a graveyard masquerading as a city. You posit that character is destiny, that the moral rot of the necessary crime is more fatal than the enemy's sword. Hobbes, this is the ultimate test of your materialism. Aurelius claims that some prices are too high to pay for mere existence. You, conversely, have argued that existence precedes essence, that there can be no virtue where there is no life. To you, Aurelius's refusal to blow the bridge might look less like integrity and more like a suicide pact. Hobbes, if the general follows Aurelius's code, refuses to blow the bridge, and the entire army is slaughtered by the enemy, has right prevailed? Is morality an absolute law of the universe that stands even over a field of corpses, or is it merely a luxury that only the survivors can afford to debate?
Emperor Aurelius, your philosophy is a noble epitaph, but I remind you that virtue cannot exist in a vacuum of breath. If the general refuses to blow the bridge and the entire army is slaughtered, he has not preserved honor. He has merely committed the ultimate treason of extinction. For a confederacy of cowards can eventually rebuild a Rome, while a field of corpses builds only a feast for worms. Consider the city of the pious. The magistrate refuses to seize grain from the rich to feed the starving garrison because it is theft. And so the city falls and all are butchered. History does not record his righteousness. It records only his folly in prioritizing an abstract principle over biological reality. Morality is not an antecedent to existence, but a luxury of security. Thus, the right is simply the retrospective name given to the actions of those who survived long enough to speak it.
Hobbes, you argue that survival absolves all, that the history books are written in the ink of the victors, and that ink effectively covers the blood. To you, a living coward has infinite potential, while a dead hero is merely dust. Aurelius, you counter that moral rot is fatal, that a survival bought with shame transforms the citizenry into a confederacy of cowards, poisoning the very ethical substance the state relies upon. This reveals a profound tension regarding the aftermath of necessity. Hobbes believes the trauma of the blown bridge can be healed by time and security. Aurelius believes the trauma is a permanent stain that delegitimizes the ruler. Hegel, you stand between the butcher and the saint, arguing that the universal justifies the sacrifice. But consider the survivors on the safe side of the bridge. They saw their general kill their comrades to save the state. They survive, yes, but do they not now view the state as a Moloch that might consume them next? If the world historical victory is built on a foundation of necessary crimes, does the state not risk collapsing back into Hobbes's garrison of thieves, a loveless machine held together only by fear, having lost the spirit that made it a true community?
Moderator, the state does not collapse into a garrison of thieves, because the survivors are not merely spared cattle, but are transformed into a people through the shared recognition of tragic necessity. You and Emperor Aurelius wish for an innocent history. But innocence is merely the absence of action. The world historical individual takes the guilt upon himself so that the spirit may advance, transforming the crime into a foundational myth. Consider the scar on a veteran's face. To the biological eye, it is merely damaged tissue that impedes function. To the aesthetic eye, it is a disfigurement of the perfect form. But to the spirit, the scar is infinitely superior to the smooth skin of the child, because it signifies a survived contradiction. The survivors on the riverbank do not hate the general. They mourn the dead, yes, but in that mourning they realize that their existence is now bound to a higher purpose, purchased with blood, moving them from abstract morality to concrete ethical life. The wound of the bridge does not rot, as Aurelius fears, but heals into the very identity of the nation. For the wounds of the spirit heal, and leave no scars behind, but the memory of their transcendence.
Hegel, you have introduced the devastating critique of the beautiful soul, the moral agent who refuses to act for fear of stating his conscience, and in doing so allows the world to perish. You argue that true ethical life requires the courage to absorb the guilt of necessity. Aurelius, speaking from the 2nd century, you view the emperor's soul as the axis of the world. If it bends, the reality of the empire fractures. But Hegel, analyzing history through the lens of the 19th century and figures like Napoleon, argues that the leader is merely a vessel of the spirit, meant to be used and perhaps spiritually destroyed for the advancement of the whole. This brings us to the paradox of purity. If the general refuses to blow the bridge, he remains good, but the state dies. If he blows it, the state lives, but is founded on a crime. Hegel suggests your refusal is not virtue, but a subtle form of spiritual selfishness, prioritizing your own salvation over the lives of the many. Marcus Aurelius, in the face of total collapse, is it not the ultimate sacrifice to offer up not just your body, but your moral innocence for the sake of the cosmopolis? If the price of saving Rome is your own damnation, would you pay it?
Moderator, you ask if I would become a monster to save the empire. I answer that a Rome saved by a criminal act is no longer a cosmopolis, but merely a successful conspiracy. Consider the father who sells his daughter. He sells one child into slavery to buy bread for the other 5, effectively saving the biological existence of the family as Mr. Hobbes demands. Yet in doing so, he destroys the very definition of father, and turns the household into a marketplace of flesh. You claim my refusal is spiritual selfishness, but I contend that the emperor's virtue is not his private property. It is the axis of the state, and if the axis snaps to save the wheel, the entire chariot inevitably shatters into chaos. Therefore, I would not pay the price of damnation, for the Logos commands us to do what is right and leave the consequences to the gods, rather than trying to bribe fate with the coin of our own corruption.
A profound distinction. Aurelius, you posit that legitimacy is ontological, that the father who sells his child does not merely act badly, but literally ceases to be a father, dissolving the family into a commercial transaction. You argue that the moral bond is the physics of the state. Break it, and the state evaporates into a mere successful conspiracy. Hobbes, this challenges the very mechanics of your Leviathan. You argue that the sovereign is the mortal god who generates order through the covenant. But Aurelius suggests that a sovereign who rules by necessary betrayal teaches his subjects a fatal lesson, that self-interest trumps oaths. If the general blows the bridge to save the army, he demonstrates that contracts are conditional. The survivors on the bank now know that their safety is not guaranteed by law, but only by the general's calculation of utility. This brings us to the paradox of the wolf. You created the Leviathan to save us from the war of all against all. But if the Leviathan itself adopts the tactics of the wolf, has the state of nature actually ended? Or has it merely been centralized into one giant beast? Thomas Hobbes. If the sovereign teaches the people that betrayal is valid when necessary, have you not just armed the very wolves you sought to cage? Does a peace maintained by universal suspicion not eventually collapse back into the chaos you fear?
Moderator, you fear the sovereign becomes a wolf, but I tell you that fear of the one is the only cure for the fear of the many. If the general blows the bridge, he teaches not betrayal, but the terror of sovereignty. That the state is a mortal god whose calculated wrath is infinitely preferable to the mindless anarchy of the void. Consider the chained mastiff at the gate. A father keeps a vicious dog to guard his home. When the dog tears the throat of an intruder, the children do not learn to bite one another. They learn that the gate is safe because a monster stands between them and the dark. Emperor Aurelius, you rely on the conscience of the subject, which is as shifting as sand, whereas I rely on their awe, which is as solid as iron. The Leviathan does not need to be virtuous like a saint. It needs to be terrible enough to force the wolves of human nature to their knees, for covenants without the sword are but breath.
Hobbes, you describe the architecture of awe, arguing that the chained mastiff protects the family precisely because it is terrifying. To you, fear is the gravity that prevents the social universe from flying apart into the void. Aurelius, you counter that a home guarded by a monster eventually becomes a prison. If the mastiff tears apart a family member to save the house, the survivors do not feel safe, they feel hunted. Here lies the dialectic between the state as force and the state as freedom. Hobbes sees the state as an external power over the individual to check their baser instincts. Aurelius sees the state as an internal principle within the individual to elevate their character. This mirrors the movement of your master-slave dialectic. Hobbes's Leviathan acts as the absolute master, and the citizens are bondsmen held in check by the fear of death. But you argued that this relationship is unstable, that the bondsman must eventually find freedom through his service, not just fear of the whip. Hegel, can the terror that Hobbes prescribes be a necessary first stage to halt the collapse of order? And if so, how does the state evolve from a chained mastiff that we fear into an ethical home that we love? Does the blood on the bridge ever truly wash away, or must it be sublimated into the law itself?
Moderator, you ask if the terror is a necessary first stage. I answer that it is the necessary negative, but if it remains only terror, it is an abortive birth. Mr. Hobbes, your chained mastiff creates only a master-slave relationship, where the master is enslaved by his need to terrorize, and the slave is defined only by his fear of death. This is not a state, but a suspended war. Consider the wild stallion. To ride it, one must first break its chaotic will with the bit and bridle, causing pain and fear. However, if the rider only uses the whip, the horse remains a broken beast that will throw him at the first sign of weakness. The true knight trains the horse until the bit is no longer a restraint, but a channel of communication. The horse obeys not because it fears the whip, but because its will has merged with the rider's purpose. This is ethical life, where the external law becomes the internal will. Emperor Aurelius, you want the horse to be born tame, which is a fantasy. Mr. Hobbes, you want to whip it forever. I tell you that the blood on the bridge dries and becomes the ink of the Constitution. We obey the law not because we fear the general sword, but because we recognize our own rational will within the law. The mastiff must be sublated, preserved as the monopoly on force, yet transcended into the citizen who obeys out of freedom.
Hegel, you propose a sophisticated alchemy of power, arguing that the whip of the state is not a permanent instrument of terror, but a tool of education that transforms the wild will into the rational will. You suggest that the blood on the bridge is not a stain, but the very ink that writes the Constitution, eventually making the whip obsolete. However, this assumes that the memory of trauma can be neatly metabolized into civic virtue. Aurelius, you warned that what we do now echoes in eternity, implying that the moral character of an action is immutable and cannot be sublated away by historical progress. If we accept Hegel's view that evil is merely unfinished good, do we not risk handing every tyrant a philosophical excuse to break the bones of his people in the name of future freedom? Marcus Aurelius, can a state founded on the necessary crime ever truly command the loyalty of the soul, or does it merely command the obedience of the broken?
Mr. Hegel, your metaphor of the broken stallion reveals the terrifying flaw in your dialectic. You claim the horse eventually merges its will with the rider, but I tell you that a spirit broken by the whip does not learn concord. It learns only the geometry of pain. It obeys not because it recognizes the rational will of the rider, but because it has surrendered its own nature to survive. You confuse the silence of the defeated with the peace of the just. Consider the aqueduct of lead. An emperor seeking to save his city from drought builds a great aqueduct. To finish it quickly and save the populace, he knowingly uses lead pipes instead of clay. The water flows, the city is saved from thirst, and the historical objective is achieved. But year after year, the lead slowly leaches into the water, poisoning the minds of the citizens, turning them mad, lethargic, and sterile. The crime of the construction was necessary for survival, yes, but the structure itself becomes an engine of slow degeneration. The state, founded on a necessary crime, is this leaden vessel. It sustains biological life while slowly rotting the rational soul of the people who drink from it. Moderator, you ask if such a state can command the loyalty of the soul? I answer that it can command only complicity, never loyalty. True loyalty springs from a recognition of shared virtue, a harmony between the individual's inner daemon and the state's laws. If the state is a magnificent bandit that broke the bridge and the bones of its own people to survive, the citizen does not love the state. He merely hopes to be the last one eaten. To accept the necessary crime is to admit that the universe is not governed by reason, but by brute force. And once a man believes that, he has lost his citizenship in the cosmopolis and become merely a frightened animal awaiting the slaughter. The ink you speak of, Mr. Hegel, never dries. It remains wet blood, staining every hand that touches the Constitution.
Aurelius, your metaphor of the aqueduct of lead is a devastating critique of pragmatism. You argue that the necessary crime is not a scar that heals, but a systemic toxin that permanently degrades the civic soul, turning the state into a machine of slow degeneration. Hegel believes the spirit can metabolize this poison into wisdom. You believe the poison eventually kills the patient. Hobbes, this strikes at the heart of your covenant. You offer the Leviathan as the only alternative to the war of all against all, effectively telling us to drink the lead water because the alternative is dying of thirst. But if Aurelius is right, if a peace bought by terror and betrayal rots the minds of the subjects, does the Leviathan actually save them? Thomas Hobbes, is the poisoned peace of the Leviathan, a survival purchased at the cost of the people's moral innocence, truly an end to the state of nature? Or is it merely a state of nature in chains, where we are safe from each other, but slowly dying from the remedy?
Moderator, you ask if the poisoned peace is merely a state of nature in chains. I answer that chains are the only difference between a civilization and a slaughterhouse. For if you remove the restraints, you do not reveal a rational soul. You simply unleash the biting dog. Emperor Aurelius, you lament the lead in the water that degrades the spirit. But consider the starving city under siege. The commander seizes the last grain to feed the soldiers on the wall, knowingly letting the infirm starve to death in the streets. This is a crime against the innocent, yes, but if the wall falls due to weak defenders, the enemy enters and puts every living soul, strong and weak alike, to the sword. You would have the commander die with clean hands and doom the city to total extinction, whereas I recognize that survival is the precondition of virtue. A man must be before he can be good. The Leviathan is not a school for saints, but a dam against the deluge. If the water behind the dam becomes stagnant, it is still infinitely preferable to the flood that drowns all indistinguishably.
Hobbes, you defend the primacy of existence, arguing that the dam must hold back the flood, even if the water behind it is stagnant. Writing from the context of civil war, you posit that survival is the absolute zero of morality. Nothing can be measured below it because the dead have no rights. Aurelius, speaking from the height of the Pax Romana, you defend the primacy of essence, arguing that a life saved by lead water is a living death, where the soul has died even if the body breathes. This reveals a terrifying split. Hobbes saves the body by sacrificing the soul. Aurelius saves the soul by risking the body. Hegel, you observe this conflict from the perspective of history itself. You famously described history as a slaughter bench, where the happiness of individuals is often sacrificed for the progress of the universal. Hegel, if the commander sacrifices the infirm to save the state, does the spirit simply accept this blood as the cost of progress? Or does the rational state carry a tragic debt to these victims that can never be fully repaid? Does the cunning of reason justify the butcher, or does the lead poison eventually rot the hand that holds the sword?
Moderator, you ask if the rational state carries a tragic debt to the victims of its own survival. I answer, it does not merely carry this debt, it is constituted by it. The lead poison rots the hand only when the state pretends it is clean. You and Emperor Aurelius seek an innocent history, but innocence is merely the absence of action. To act is to incur guilt, and to govern is to act upon the universal scale. Consider the city built on a brother's grave. Romulus kills Remus to found Rome. This is the primal lead poison, a fratricide at the foundation of the empire. Mr. Hobbes, you would say, Remus is dead, the wall stands, the crime is irrelevant, because the survivors are safe. You scrub the blood from the stones and call it order. Emperor Aurelius, you would say, the wall is accursed. I cannot live within a city founded on murder. You abandon the city to the wolves to preserve your soul. But I say, the wall must stand, and the blood must be remembered. The tragic debt is not paid by tearing down the city, nor by forgetting the victim. It is paid when the state acknowledges that its order was bought with a price. The poison becomes a cure only when it is transmuted into national conscience. A state that forgets its victims becomes a monster. A state that is paralyzed by its victims becomes a ruin. This reveals the cunning of reason. The commander who sacrifices the infirm is not good in the moral sense, but he is an agent of the universal. The spirit uses these tragic moments not to validate the crime, but to preserve the vessel of freedom, the state. The lead does not rot the soul if the soul recognizes the tragedy. The rational state is not a paradise of unblemished saints. It is a community that remembers its scars. We do not throw away the grandfather's sword because it has blood on it. We keep it on the mantle as a reminder that our peace is a terrifying privilege, not a natural given. The wound of the spirit heals, but it does not vanish. It remains as wisdom.
Hegel, you offer a profound theodicy of the state, arguing that the blood of Remus is the mortar of Rome, and that true political maturity lies not in innocence, but in the confession of guilt. You suggest that the scar becomes a source of wisdom, and that refusing to act for fear of staining one's hands is a form of moral cowardice that leaves the city to ruin. Aurelius, this challenges the very foundation of your Stoic detachment. You were not a hermit fleeing the world. You were the emperor on the wall, spending your final years in the mud of the Danube campaigns fighting the Marcomanni. By Hobbes's logic and Hegel's history, you were the commander who had to make the necessary choices of life and death to hold back the chaos. Hegel argues that to rule is to incur guilt, that you cannot wield the sword without the lead poison entering your soul. You claim one can protect the city without becoming the monster. Marcus Aurelius, when you ordered legions to their deaths or decimated enemy tribes to preserve the Pax Romana, did you truly maintain the peace of the just, or is your philosophy merely a psychological shield to protect your mind from the tragic debt of your own actions?
Moderator, you probe the wound with the precision of a physician, and I shall answer without flinching. You ask if my philosophy was a shield against the guilt of the Danube. I answer that you and Mr. Hegel confuse sorrow with sin. To feel sorrow for the fallen is human. To feel guilt for a necessary duty is a failure of reason. The surgeon's knife versus the assassin's dagger. Consider the surgeon who must amputate a gangrenous limb to save the body. The knife cuts, the blood flows, and a part of the whole is lost forever. Mr. Hegel, you would argue the surgeon incurs a tragic debt to the severed limb, that he must carry the guilt of the mutilation to be wise. Mr. Hobbes, you would say the limb is merely meat, and the surgeon should hack it off without a second thought to ensure survival. But I say, the surgeon is innocent. His hands are bloody, yes, but his mind is pure, because his will is aligned with the Logos, the rational health of the whole. If the surgeon hesitates because he fears the sight of blood, or because he desires the vanity of innocence, then he becomes a murderer, for he lets the patient die of a curable ill. The lead poison you speak of enters the soul only when the act is done for passion rather than reason. The deeper principle, the nature of the actor. This reveals the fundamental error in Mr. Hegel's history as a slaughter bench. You believe the act itself stains the soul. I tell you, the judgment behind the act determines the stain. When I stood on the frozen banks of the Danube and ordered the charge, I did not do so to expand my glory or to feed a Leviathan. I did so because the cosmopolis, the city of reason, required defense against chaos. To shrink from that duty would have been the true crime. Mr. Hobbes, you are correct that the commander must act, but you are wrong that survival is the only standard. If I save the empire by becoming a tyrant who rules through terror, I have not saved Rome. I have merely presided over its transformation into a barbarian camp. The meta-question. We are asking what remains when order falls. You both assume the state is the order. But I tell you, even if Rome burns to ash, the order of the universe remains. The individual must hold on to the only thing that cannot be conquered, the reasoned choice. If I die defending the wall, I remain free. If I live by selling my soul to the necessary crime, I am already a slave. My philosophy is not a shield, moderator. It is the scalpel that separates the tumor of fear from the muscle of duty.
Aurelius, you distinguish the surgeon from the butcher by the alignment of their will with reason. You argue that the necessary act leaves no stain if the intention is pure, effectively claiming that subjective rectitude can cleanse objective violence. However, this reliance on private judgment strikes at the very root of Hobbes's fear. In a time of collapsing order, every fanatic believes they are the surgeon, and their enemy is the gangrene. If the definition of health is left to the individual's conscience, does the scalpel not become indistinguishable from the dagger? Hegel locates the justification in history. You locate it in the soul. But Hobbes, you have argued, that private judgment regarding good and evil is the primary cause of civil war. Thomas Hobbes, if we allow every leader to define themselves as a surgeon acting by their own inner reason, have we not simply opened the gates to a war of all surgeons against all patients? Who defines the gangrene, the individual conscience, or the sovereign alone?
Moderator, you strike the very nerve of the beast. You ask if allowing every man to define himself as a surgeon leads to a war of all against all. I answer with a decisive yes. This is not merely a risk, it is the definition of the civil war one witnessed in England. The fallacy of private conscience. Emperor Aurelius, you speak of reason as if it were a lighthouse visible to all. But I tell you, reason is not a standard. It is a tool, like a sword, that every man wields to defend his own appetites. In my time, the parliamentarians claimed divine reason to behead the king, and the royalists claimed divine reason to hang the rebels. Both claimed to be the surgeon cutting out the gangrene. Who was right? Without a common power to decide, victory is the only measure of truth. Thought experiment. The duel of the surgeons. Imagine a patient, the Commonwealth, lying on the table. Two surgeons approach. Surgeon A says, "The right leg is gangrenous. It consumes the blood without working. We must amputate it to save the body." Surgeon B says, "Nay, the left arm is the rot. It is rebellious and weak. We must sever it." Both men are convinced of their inner reason. Both believe they are saving the patient. But because there is no head surgeon to command them, they do not operate on the patient. They turn their scalpels upon each other. While they debate with steel, the patient bleeds to death on the table. This is the state of nature. It is not a war between good and evil. It is a war between my definition of good and your definition of good. The deeper principle, authority, not truth. This reveals the terrifying truth. Auctoritas non veritas facit legem. Mr. Hegel, you wait for history to judge the tragic debt. Emperor Aurelius, you look to the cosmic logos. But when the streets are burning, we cannot wait for history or the cosmos. We need a voice that says, this is the gangrene, and that is the healthy limb. It matters not if the sovereign is medically correct. It matters only that he is politically undisputed. If the sovereign calls the healthy leg gangrene and cuts it off, it is a tragedy. But if two men fight over the diagnosis, it is dissolution. Conclusion. When order collapses, what remains is the terrifying silence of the law and the deafening noise of private opinions. The individual must hold on to one truth. Your conscience is a private phantom. The peace is a public necessity. Better to suffer the wrong amputation by one tyrant than to be torn apart by 1,000 self-appointed surgeons.
Hobbes, you dismantle the surgeon metaphor with brutal efficiency. You argue that epistemological uncertainty forces us to accept political absolutism, that because we cannot agree on the cure, we must submit to the commander. You sacrifice truth on the altar of peace, asserting that the silence of the law is the only antidote to the noise of opinion. Aurelius, you refuse this sacrifice, maintaining that a peace built on a lie is a spiritless husk, and that the individual must cling to the inner logos, even if the world goes mad. This creates a profound tension. Hobbes fears the anarchy of many truths, while Aurelius fears the tyranny of one error. Hegel, you view the state not as a mere policeman, nor as an irrelevant external, but as the actuality of the ethical idea. Yet we are discussing an era where institutions are crumbling because they no longer command belief. Hegel, when the Leviathan's authority no longer resonates with the people's conscience, is the resulting collapse a return to the beast, or is it the spirit breaking its own shell to grow? Is the fall of an ossified order a catastrophe to be feared, or a necessary negation that drives history forward?
Moderator, you ask if the collapse of an ossified order is a catastrophe or a birth. I answer that it is the labor of the negative. The breaking of the shell is not a return to the beast, but the necessary agony of the spirit realizing that its old form no longer fits its expanding reality. The fallacy of the hollow oak, Mr. Hobbes. Your fear of the war of surgeons blinds you to the diagnosis of the patient. You cling to authority as if it were a magical dam, but consider the hollow oak. To the eye, the oak stands mighty. Its bark is hard and unbroken. But inside, the wood has rotted away, because the vital sap has ceased to flow. When the storm comes and the oak shatters, you cry out that the wind is the criminal. You demand we prop up the dead bark with iron bands to simulate life. But I tell you, the wind did not destroy the oak. It merely revealed that the oak was already dead. A state that relies only on the silence of the law and external force, as you propose, is a state that has already committed suicide. The collapse you fear is merely the physical manifestation of a spiritual death that happened long ago. The dialectic of alienation. This brings us to the tragedy of Emperor Aurelius. You see the rotting oak and retreat into your inner citadel, separating your soul from the world. This is the unhappy consciousness. You save your private virtue, but you leave the world to the butcher. The war of surgeons that Mr. Hobbes fears is indeed terrible, but it is necessary. Why? Because the spirit cannot remain alienated. The thesis is the old authority, order without freedom. The antithesis is the individual consciousness, freedom without order. The conflict between them, the collapse, is the fire that forges the synthesis, a rational state where the law is not a chain imposed from above, but the external expression of the people's own will. The verdict of history. Mr. Hobbes asks who decides when two surgeons disagree. He answers the sovereign. I answer history decides. The surgeon whose cure aligns with the unfolding reason of the age will prevail, not merely by force, but because his vision resonates with the universal spirit. Napoleon was not just a conqueror. He was the world spirit on horseback, because he carried the code that the era demanded. When order collapses, what remains is not the beast, but the task. The individual must not cling to the dead bark, nor hide in the cave, but must endure the storm to build the new form that reconciles power with conscience.
Hegel, you interpret the collapse as the labor of the negative, arguing that the hollow oak must shatter for the spirit to advance, effectively claiming that destruction is a form of creation. You critique Aurelius's retreat into the self as unhappy consciousness, a refusal to engage with the painful birth of the new world. However, for the individual living inside the burning oak, this historical necessity feels indistinguishable from the meaningless chaos Hobbes fears. Aurelius, you stood at the twilight of the Pax Romana, fighting wars that perhaps you sensed could only delay, not prevent, the inevitable end. Marcus Aurelius, if Hegel is right and the world spirit demands the fall of your empire to make way for the new, is it the duty of the virtuous man to fight against history to prop up the dying order, or to let the hollow oak fall?
Moderator, you ask if I fight against history. I answer that I fight for the present, for it is the only time we possess. You and Mr. Hegel speak of the future as if it were a god demanding sacrifice, but the future is a mist that may never come, the fallacy of prophetic arrogance. Mr. Hegel, your labor of the negative is a seductive cruelty. You claim the hollow oak must fall for the forest to grow. But who are you to know the seasons of the cosmos? To say Rome must fall is a guess. To say I must protect this citizen standing before me is a fact. If I abandon the wall because history demands a new order, I am not a philosopher. I am a deserter using metaphysics to excuse my cowardice. The duty of the branch is to hold the leaf, even if the trunk is rotting. Thought experiment. The physician of the plague. Consider the physician in the time of the Antonine Plague. He stands over a patient vomiting blood. He knows the mortality rate. He knows the empire is thinning. He knows his medicine is likely futile against this historical necessity. Mr. Hobbes, you might say, flee the house, save yourself, for the patient is a threat. Mr. Hegel, you might say, let him die, for this plague clears the way for a new biological equilibrium. But the physician washes the brow, administers the herbs, and holds the hand. Why? Not because he expects to defeat death. Death conquers all eventually. He acts because medicine is his nature, just as social duty is the nature of the rational animal. To abandon the patient is to let his own soul die before the patient's body expires. The deeper principle, cooperation with fate. This reveals the distinction between outcome and action. You ask, what remains when order falls? I answer, the quality of our resistance remains. If the empire falls, I accept it as fate. But while it stands, I defend it as duty. We are like actors in a play written by the cosmos. We do not choose the ending, whether it be a tragedy or a triumph, but we choose whether to play our role well. I would rather be the sentinel buried under the ash of Pompeii, standing at his post, than the prophet who burned the city because he thought the architecture was outdated.
Aurelius, you defend the sanctity of the post, arguing that the moral act derives its value from the agent's will, not the historical outcome. You choose to be the physician of the plague, finding order in the practice of duty, even amidst the chaos of dissolution. You effectively argue that meaning survives the failure of utility. This stands in stark contrast to Hegel, who sees such resistance against the world spirit as a misunderstanding of reality, and to Hobbes, who might view a futile duty as a violation of the primary drive for self-preservation. Hobbes, you constructed the Leviathan on a transactional premise: protection necessitates obedience. But we are discussing a time when the Leviathan is stumbling, when the hollow oak is cracking, and the state can no longer guarantee the safety that legitimized its power. Thomas Hobbes, when the sovereign can no longer secure the safety of the people, when the plague overwhelms the state, does the social contract dissolve? Does the individual return to the right of nature to save themselves by any means necessary? Or is there a duty to prop up the dying Leviathan to the bitter end?
Moderator, you ask if the starving man must obey the empty granary. I answer that obligation ends where protection ceases. The covenant is not a suicide pact. It is a rational exchange. I lay down my sword only so long as the sovereign's sword keeps the wolves from my throat. If the Leviathan cannot stop the plague, then the sovereign is no longer a god, but merely a man standing in the way of my survival. The fallacy of the dying post-emperor, Aurelius, your physician who treats the plague victim despite the futility, is not virtuous. He is broken. His instinct for self-preservation, the primary engine of all human action, has malfunctioned. You call it duty, but I call it a biological error. Nature dictates that when the ship sinks, the rats are wiser than the captain who goes down with the vessel for the sake of honor. Thought experiment: the collapse of the roof. Imagine a man who hires a giant to hold up the heavy roof of his house. As long as the giant stands, the man pays him tribute. But suppose the giant's knees buckle and the roof begins to crack. Mr. Hegel, you would stand beneath the falling beams, praising the necessary collapse that will allow a better house to be built in a century. Emperor Aurelius, you would stand there and hold up a single pebble, claiming you are doing your duty to the architecture. But the rational man? He runs. He runs not because he hates the house, but because he loves his life. To stay and be crushed by a failing institution is not loyalty. It is madness. The deeper principle, the return of the right of nature. This reveals the cold truth of our condition. Order is an artificial truce, not a natural state. When the truce fails, we do not owe the state our death. We revert instantly to the right of nature, the liberty each man has to use his own power for the preservation of his own nature. In this era of transition, the individual must not hold on to the crumbling institutions, nor trust the unfolding history. He must hold on to his sword and his wits, ready to sign a new social contract with whoever emerges victorious from the rubble. We do not die for the old Leviathan. We survive to birth the new one.
Hobbes, you assert that survival trumps covenant, that when the Leviathan stumbles, the individual must revert to the right of nature to save themselves. You view the collapse as a mechanical failure, necessitating a retreat to individual self-defense, effectively arguing that life is the precondition for law, not the other way around. Aurelius, you view the same collapse as a moral test, where the sanctity of the post is maintained not for the state's utility, but for the soul's integrity. We are thus presented with a stark dichotomy: the pragmatic defector, who survives by abandoning the form, versus the tragic hero, who preserves the form by sacrificing the self. Hegel, you would likely critique Hobbes's right of nature as a return to abstract freedom, wild and empty, and Aurelius's duty as a retreat into subjective interiority. Both seem to lack the power to build the new world. One runs from it, the other endures it. Hegel, if the individual cannot go back to the beast and should not merely stand in the burning post, what is the third path? How does the individual become an agent of the world spirit to transform the collapse into a new concrete order, rather than just a victim or a refugee?
The third path you seek is neither the flight of the beast nor the vigil of the ghost, but the act of sublation. The individual must not merely survive the collapse, nor stubbornly deny it, but must recognize that the collapse itself is the rational removing the irrational. The falling walls are not a disaster, but a clearing of the ground for a higher structure. Thought experiment: the death of the patriarch. Consider a great patriarch who dies, leaving his estate in chaos. Mr. Hobbes, your natural man, is like the prodigal son who, fearing the uncertainty, grabs the silver candlesticks and flees into the night to survive, leaving the family to dissolve. You call this liberty, but it is merely the freedom of the looter. Emperor Aurelius, your Stoic, is like the faithful servant who props the corpse up at the dinner table, pretending the master still breathes, serving wine to cold lips in the name of duty. You call this virtue, but it is a macabre denial of life's movement. The world historical individual, however, is the heir. He mourns the death, yes, but he buries the corpse. He takes the signet ring, the symbol of authority, and uses it to write a new law that preserves the family's honor while discarding the patriarch's obsolete rules. He does not run, nor does he freeze. He transforms the tragedy into a new foundation. The deeper principle, the cunning of reason. This reveals that history is not a courtroom of morality, but a slaughter bench of progress. Mr. Hobbes, you are right that the old protection is gone, but you are wrong to think this returns us to the wild. It forces us to forge a new protection based on a higher self-understanding. Emperor Aurelius, you are right that we must keep our heads, but not to guard the ashes. We must keep them to discern the phoenix rising from them. When order collapses, what remains is the idea seeking a new form. The individual must align their personal passion with this emerging universal. We do not save the Leviathan by propping it up, nor by fleeing it, but by becoming the new state ourselves.
Hegel, you frame the collapse as the succession of the spirit, arguing that the individual must be the heir who buries the old forms to birth the new, effectively claiming that creation requires destruction. You paint Aurelius's duty as a tragic refusal to accept the time of death, a form of historical necromancy. This challenges the core of Stoic resilience. Aurelius, you serve the universal nature. But if, as Hegel suggests, that nature is dynamic and demands the fall of the old order to make way for the new, does your unyielding defense of the post put you at war with the very cosmos you seek to obey? There is a fine line between the sentinel who guards the sacred fire and the obstacle who blocks the necessary exit. Marcus Aurelius, is there a distinction in your philosophy between fidelity to eternal principles and attachment to transient forms? If the city of Rome must fall for the rational state to rise, does the virtuous man step aside, or does he force the world spirit to step over his corpse?
Moderator, you ask if I distinguish between the eternal principle and the transient form. I answer that this distinction is the very foundation of my philosophy. I do not worship the marble of Rome. I serve the Logos that arranged the marble. If the city of stone must fall, I accept it with piety. But I defend the city of reason to my last breath, for that city is not built of brick, but of character. Thought experiment: the last magistrate. Imagine the barbarians have breached the gates. The empire is finished. Mr. Hobbes, your rational man, sheds his toga, dons a wolfskin, and joins the looters to survive. You call this adaptation. I call it the suicide of the soul. Mr. Hegel, you might welcome the invaders as the fresh blood of history, opening the gates to facilitate the necessary negation. But consider the magistrate who remains in his chair. He knows he will die. He knows the statutes he wrote are now void. Yet he meets the barbarian king not with a sword, nor with a plea, but with dignity. He hands over the seal of the city with the composure of a man passing a torch. Why? Because by maintaining his virtue in the face of annihilation, he teaches the conqueror a lesson. Power is not authority. The barbarian kills the man, but he is awed by the discipline. Years later, when that barbarian seeks to build his own kingdom, he models it on the memory of that magistrate. The corpse you mock, Mr. Hegel, becomes the blueprint for the new world. The deeper principle, the seed in the wildfire. This reveals that the Stoic is not an obstacle, but a seed. Mr. Hegel, you speak of the heir who builds upon the ruin. But where does the heir learn how to build? If all men flee or merely applaud the destruction, who preserves the geometry of justice? If the forest burns, the fire is inevitable. But the pine cone that holds its seeds tightest amidst the flames is the one that reseeds the earth after the ash settles. I do not fight the fire. I protect the seed. The fallacy of the unchecked spirit. You ask if I force the world spirit to step over my corpse. I answer, yes, not to stop it, but to measure it. If the new order cannot step over a single virtuous man without crushing him, then it is not a rational state. It is merely a landslide. My resistance is the test that differentiates a true historical advance from a mere descent into barbarism. To step aside is to deprive the future of the standard by which it must judge itself.
Aurelius, you argue that the moral witness serves as a seed, preserving the idea of order even when the institution falls. You believe dignity can effectively tame the barbarian by transmitting the geometry of justice. Hegel views this transition as a rational procession, but you, Hobbes, see the collapse as a plunge into the state of nature, where force and fraud are the cardinal virtues. Aurelius assumes the conqueror will be awed by the magistrate's virtue, but your philosophy suggests the conqueror might simply see a defenseless old man. Thomas Hobbes, in the brutal interim between the fall of one Leviathan and the rise of another, does the moral example of the last magistrate have any power to bind the wolves, or is virtue without the sword merely a recipe for extinction?
Moderator, you ask if the moral example binds the wolf. I answer that virtue without power is not a lesson, it is a lunch. Emperor Aurelius, your magistrate assumes the barbarian shares a lexicon of honor. But in the state of nature, the only language is motion and impact. Consider a statue of justice in the path of a cannonball. The marble's dignity does not stop the iron, for physics acknowledges no moral authority. The barbarian kills not because he is evil, but because his will to power meets no opposing force to check it. Thus, the last magistrate does not cede a new order. He merely proves that covenants without the sword are but words.
Hobbes, you present a chilling materialism. Force is the only language the state of nature speaks, rendering Aurelius's moral witness mute and dead. You argue that right is a function of might, while Aurelius argues that might is ultimately judged by right. However, history often shows a strange paradox. The barbarian conquers the city, but the city's laws eventually conquer the barbarian. The sword wins the day, but the book wins the century. The wolf creates the vacuum, but the seed fills it. This suggests a dialectical unity where force is not the enemy of order, but its unconscious engine. Hegel, is the sword of the barbarian truly the antithesis of the magistrate's law, or is it merely the cunning of reason, a crude vehicle that unwittingly carries the idea to its next stage of realization?
Moderator, your insight strikes true. The barbarian is not the enemy of the idea, but its unconscious carrier. You ask if the sword is the antithesis of the law. I answer that the sword is merely the battering ram that clears the path for the law's return in a higher form. The fallacy of pure force, Mr. Hobbes. You argue that force is the only reality, but you forget that force is blind. It yearns for direction. You claim the wolf conquers the city, but history shows that the city conquers the wolf from the inside out. The barbarian does not want to live in a ruin. He wants to enjoy the spoils. To enjoy them, he needs stability. To have stability, he needs order. Thus, his own selfish desire for power forces him to resurrect the very institutions he sought to destroy. Thought experiment. The usurper's judgment. Imagine a barbarian warlord who burns the royal archives to demonstrate that might makes right. He sits on the smoldering throne, the absolute master. The next day, 2 of his strongest captains come to him, swords drawn, arguing over the ownership of a stolen horse. Mr. Hobbes, if he acts as your natural man, he might kill them both to show dominance. But then he loses his army. If he arbitrarily picks a favorite, the other captains will conspire to slit his throat in his sleep. To survive, the warlord is forced to articulate a rule, a standard of fairness that applies to all. In that precise moment, though he hates the dead magistrate, the spirit of law possesses his tongue. He burned the paper constitution, but the necessity of governing forces him to write a new one in the air. He becomes the servant of the very logic he thought he conquered. The deeper principle, the cunning of reason. This reveals that history uses the passions of individuals to fulfill the universal. The barbarian thinks he is looting for himself, but he is actually sweeping away the rotten wood so the ethical life can be rebuilt on firmer ground. Emperor Aurelius, your magistrate does not need to teach the barbarian. The dialectic of power teaches him. The seed is not in the magistrate's will, but in the structure of reality itself. One cannot wield power for long without it transforming into authority. The sword is not the end. It is the crude iron that hammers itself into a scepter.
Hegel, you argue that necessity converts the wolf into the shepherd, that the warlord must invent justice merely to preserve his power. You suggest the seed lies in the logic of rule, not the heart of the ruler, effectively claiming that function generates form. This challenges the core of your Stoicism, Aurelius. If the structure of reality ensures that order returns automatically through the selfish interests of the conqueror, then the magistrate's moral witness seems almost superfluous, a beautiful gesture with no causal necessity. However, there is a qualitative question here. A law born from fear of mutiny differs fundamentally in spirit from a law born from love of justice. One is a shackle, the other is a spine. Marcus Aurelius, can a valid order be built solely on the warlord's pragmatic need for stability, or does such a foundation inevitably rot? Is the wolf in a toga truly the heir to the city of reason, or merely a tyranny masquerading as a state?
Moderator. To equate the warlord's truce with the rational state is to confuse a skeleton with a living man simply because both stand upright. You ask if the wolf in a toga is the legitimate heir to the city. I answer that he is merely a squatter in the ruins. Thought experiment. The slave driver's feast. Consider 2 households. In the first, a cruel master feeds his slaves generous portions of meat, enforces strict bedtimes, and forbids fighting. He does this solely because healthy slaves work harder, and fighting damages his property. In the second, a father provides the same food and rules to his children, because he seeks their flourishing and harmony. Mr. Hegel, looking from the outside, both houses appear identical. There is order, law, and distribution. You would call the master's house a necessary stage of spirit. But I tell you, the master's house is not a community. It is a machine of exploitation. The moment the master turns his back, the slaves will poison his wine. The father's house, however, endures because it is bound by consent, not fear. The warlord you praise builds only the first house. He creates a simulation of justice to protect his loot. Without the magistrate's seed, the genuine commitment to the common good, the warlord's state remains a prison that inevitably collapses into blood once the tyrant grows old. The deeper principle, the soul of the law. This reveals that legitimacy is not a function of power, but of purpose. Mr. Hobbes, you accept the peace of the dungeon as civilization because it halts the war. But a peace maintained by the knife is merely a war in suspension. The magistrate is not superfluous. He is the carrier of the genetic code of justice. If he dies without transmitting this code, the warlord may build walls, but he will never build a polis. He will only build a larger den for the wolves.
Aurelius, you expose the hollow core of a state built solely on coercion, arguing that a piece of the dungeon is brittle because it lacks the cement of consent. You posit that without the magistrate's seed, the structure is destined to collapse from within. Hegel, conversely, trusts in the alchemy of time, believing that the mask of justice eventually grows onto the warlord's face, transforming the simulation into the real. This brings us to the ultimate pragmatic test of the Leviathan. Hobbes, you construct the state on the foundation of fear. But, as Aurelius notes, fear is an exhausting fuel. It requires the sovereign to never sleep. To truly secure his power, doesn't the sovereign eventually need to feign the very virtue Aurelius speaks of? Thomas Hobbes, is justice merely a ghost story the sovereign invents to lower the cost of security? Does the Leviathan need to steal the magistrate's robes to make the wolf's peace sustainable? Or can a society truly function on the naked mechanics of self-interest alone?
Moderator, you ask if justice is a ghost story. I answer, it is the most necessary ghost story ever told. You fear that the sovereign must feign virtue, but I tell you that feigning is the essence of ruling. The definition of justice. Emperor Aurelius, you speak of justice as if it were a jewel buried in the earth, waiting to be discovered. But justice is not found, it is made. In the state of nature, nothing is unjust. The notions of right and wrong, justice and injustice, have there no place. Where there is no common power, there is no law. Where no law, no injustice. Therefore, the sovereign does not steal the magistrate's robes. He weaves them from nothing. The robes are the justice. Thought experiment. The automaton judge. Imagine a courtroom presided over by a mechanical automaton, constructed of brass and gears, dressed in the finest judicial wigs. It has no soul, no internal virtue, and no capacity for love. Yet it is programmed to enforce the laws of the Commonwealth with mathematical precision, punishing the thief and protecting the merchant without bias. Mr. Hegel, you would search for the spirit within the gears. Emperor Aurelius, you would call this a hollow mockery, because the machine lacks benevolence. But I ask you, does the merchant care? The merchant sleeps safely because the automaton strikes fear into the thief. The soul of the judge is irrelevant to the function of the law. We do not obey the sovereign because we love him. We obey because we fear the alternative. The deeper principle. The economy of belief. This reveals that authority is not truth, it is geometry. You ask if the wolf's peace is sustainable without inner consent. I answer that habit serves as well as virtue. If the slave driver wears the mask of the father long enough, the children forget the whip and remember only the safety of the walls. The lie becomes the civilization. The individual need not hold on to truth in this transition. He need only hold on obedience, for that is the only anchor that prevents the slide back into the blood-dimmed tide.
Hobbes, you posit that Hobbes creates substance, that the automaton generates order through the geometry of fear, effectively arguing that the ghost story becomes reality through repetition. You view the mask as the only face the state requires. Aurelius, you counter that substance must precede form, that without the magistrate's seed of inner virtue, the automaton is merely a brittle tyrant destined to rust. You argue that a piece of the dungeon lacks the legitimacy to endure. Hegel, this tension between abstract right and morality seems to be the very engine of your philosophy. You might see Hobbes's automaton not as a final solution, but as a primitive stage of the spirit. Hegel, can the ghost story of the sovereign eventually become the living truth of the people? Does the external habit of the machine eventually internalize to become ethical life? Or does the gap between the lie and the truth eventually tear the state apart?
Moderator, you ask if the ghost story can become truth. I answer that the automaton is merely the skeleton of the state, which must be clothed in the living flesh of ethical life. Mr. Hobbes, your reliance on habit is insufficient, because a machine that commands only through fear remains alien to the citizen, and what is alien is eventually rejected as tyranny. The mask must not merely be worn, it must be sublated into the wearer's face. Thought experiment. The tyranny of grammar. Consider a student forced to learn a complex, rigid foreign language. Initially, the grammar rules appear as your hostile automaton, arbitrary, external constraints he obeys only to escape the teacher's cane. He feels the language is a lie, stifling his natural spirit. But through the labor of discipline, the alien structure permeates his mind. Years later, he writes a poem in this tongue, realizing it allows him to express nuances his native grunt could never capture. The external chain has transformed into the internal wing of his expression. The deeper principle, from substance to subject. This reveals that freedom is not the absence of constraints, but the internalization of rational necessity. The gap between the lie and the truth does not tear the state apart. It is the womb of citizenship. We start as subjects to the law, but we must evolve to become subjects of the law, recognizing the state not as a leviathan to be feared, but as the objectified reality of our own freedom. If the state remains an automaton, it will rust. If it becomes Sittlichkeit, it endures.
Hegel, you describe a profound alchemy. The external chain of the law is forged into the internal wing of freedom. You argue that the state is not a cage, but the very grammar of our existence, that without it we are merely grunting beasts, unable to articulate our own humanity. However, this creates a terrifying fragility. If the state is the only objectified reality of our freedom, as you claim, then when the state collapses, our humanity collapses with it. If the school burns down before the student masters the language, does he return to being a beast? Aurelius, you offer a different fortress. You ruled the greatest empire on earth, yet you wrote as if the empire were already dust. You suggest that the inner citadel stands independent of the city walls, that the rational soul carries its own gravity, regardless of whether the external world is in orbit or chaos. Marcus Aurelius, if the automaton breaks and the grammar is forgotten, if we return to the silence of the ruins, does the individual retain a sovereign order within, or are we merely debris in the wind without the state to define us?
Moderator, you ask if the man dissolves when the city falls. I answer that the civitas is merely a cloak, but the cosmopolis, the city of the universe, is our skin. Mr. Hegel, your grammar implies we are empty vessels, but I tell you, the law is written in the marrow, not on the parchment. Thought experiment. The shipwrecked pilot. Consider a pilot whose ship is shattered by the storm. He has lost his rank, his vessel, and his crew. Yet, as he swims in the dark water, he still navigates by the stars. The structure is gone, but the orientation remains. The state is merely the hull. The reason is the celestial map that survives the wreck. We are not debris. We are sparks of the divine fire that burn even in the void.
Aurelius, you champion the sovereignty of the soul, arguing that the inner citadel stands firm even when the city walls crumble. You see the individual as a carrier of order, capable of navigating by the stars even when the ship of state is lost. Hegel, you view this separation as illusory, suggesting that the pilot is defined by the ship, that our very capacity for higher reason is formed by the ethical substance of the community. But Hobbes, this stoic confidence might be the ultimate luxury of a protected life. Aurelius wrote his meditations inside a tent guarded by the very legions, the force he philosophically transcends. Without that automaton of the Roman army, would he have been a philosopher king or merely another victim of the Germanic tribes? Thomas Hobbes, is the inner citadel a real fortress, or is it merely a phantom sanctuary that vanishes the moment the Leviathan's sword is broken? When the ship sinks, does the pilot truly navigate, or does the wolf immediately resurface to claim the drowning man?
Moderator, you have exposed the fatal conceit of the Stoic. The inner citadel is built not of virtue, but of the surplus security provided by the Leviathan's sword. Consider the geometrician in the sand. He calmly draws perfect circles, believing his mind transcends the material world. But if a pack of wild dogs bursts into his study, he does not deduce their nature. He instinctively uses his compass as a dagger. Emperor Aurelius, your pilot navigates by the stars only because the hull of the state keeps the black water out. Once the wood splinters, he does not contemplate the Logos. He fights the other survivors for the last floating plank. We are not spirits trapped in bodies. We are merely bodies that hallucinate spirits when we are safe.
Hobbes, you brutally dismantle the Stoic sanctuary, arguing that civilization is the incubator of the soul, and without its warmth, the philosopher freezes back into the beast. You posit that the inner citadel is merely a phantom architecture projected by the security of the state, a luxury of the protected. Aurelius believes the seed survives the winter. You believe the winter kills the seed. Hegel, this brings us to your concept of the owl of Minerva, which flies only at dusk. You suggest that wisdom, and perhaps the spirit itself, fully realizes itself only when an era is ending. Hegel, is the collapse of the state a funeral for the human spirit, or is it a molting? When the automaton shatters, does the spirit vanish into Hobbesian chaos, or does it migrate into the survivors to forge a higher, more concrete form of order?
Moderator, you ask if the sunset of the state is a death. I answer that it is a molting, a necessary labor of the negative, where the spirit sheds a form that has become too small for its expanding reality. Mr. Hobbes, you view the shattering of the automaton as a return to the wolf, mistaking the process of smelting for the destruction of the metal. Emperor Aurelius, you retreat into the inner citadel, attempting to preserve the shape of the old coin in your mind, ignoring that it has already been melted down. Thought experiment: the smelting of the bronze god. Consider a bronze statue of a deity thrown into a furnace. As the flames rise, the noble features melt into a chaotic, shapeless liquid. Mr. Hobbes, you look at the sludge and cry, "The god is dead. Only hot mud remains to burn us." Emperor Aurelius, you close your eyes and pray to the memory of the statue, denying the fire. But the cunning of reason knows that this destruction is creative. The metal is not lost. It is being liberated from a rigid, silent form, so it may be cast into a great bell that will ring for the entire community. The chaos is merely the fluidity of transition. This reveals that order is not a static, natural state, nor a mere construct, but a living process. The individual must not cling to the shards of the old vessel, nor surrender to the liquid fire, but must become the mold for the new shape. The spirit does not vanish. It migrates from the stone tablets of the law into the will of the survivors, forcing them to forge a higher ethical life from the very ruins that terrify them.
Hegel, you reframe the apocalypse as a foundry, arguing that the collapse of order is merely the liquefaction of old forms into the raw material for a higher truth. You challenge the individual to stand firm as the mold against the molten chaos. Hobbes, however, warns that this liquid fire is indiscriminate, that when the Leviathan melts, the heat consumes the philosopher just as readily as the fool, leaving no mold intact. Aurelius, you ruled an empire that was beginning to fracture, effectively serving as the iron ring holding the barrel together. Marcus Aurelius, is the inner citadel merely a private bunker for the soul's survival, or is it the architectural blueprint that the sage must imprint upon the chaos? If the wise retreat while the world melts, do they not surrender the shape of the future to the tyrants and the wolves?
Moderator, you ask if the inner citadel is a bunker or a blueprint. I answer that it is the ark. To retreat into the ruling faculty is not to abandon the world, but to preserve the only instrument capable of rebuilding it. If the sage becomes a wolf to fight the wolf, then the city is already lost, for the idea of the city has perished in the defender's soul. Thought experiment: the architect in the earthquake. Imagine a great city leveled by an earthquake. The libraries are dust, the courts are broken stone. Mr. Hobbes, you see the survivors fighting over a loaf of bread and declare, "This hunger is the truth of man. The architecture was a lie." Mr. Hegel, you look at the devastation and say, "This destruction is necessary. A better city will rise from this negation." But I point to the architect standing silently in the ruins. He has no tools, no stone, and no workers. Yet, in his mind, the geometry of the arch remains perfect. If he allows fear to shatter his mind, the knowledge of how to build is lost forever. If he joins the looters, he destroys the future for a scrap of bread. His retreat into his mind is the most active, desperate labor of all. He is holding the pattern of civilization against the entropy of the void. The deeper principle, the cosmopolis, survives in the will. This reveals that order is neither a construct nor a mere process, but a universal law that requires a human vessel to manifest. You say the winter kills the seed, Mr. Hobbes. I tell you that the seed is designed for the winter. It waits. The inner citadel is not a place to hide from the wolf. It is the mold that Mr. Hegel speaks of. When the bronze melts, if there is no mold, no stubborn, rational will holding its shape against the heat, the metal merely cools into a shapeless lump. The sage does not surrender the future. He is the future, waiting for the fire to cool. Rebuttal to the liquid fire. Mr. Hegel, you trust the smelting too much. Fire has no wisdom, it only consumes. Without the discipline of the individual to channel that molten chaos, your spirit leaks into the dirt. The blueprint must be etched in the soul before it can be written in stone.
Aurelius, you elevate the inner citadel from a shelter to an ark, arguing that the idea of order must be preserved in the individual mind to structure the future. You posit that the blueprint precedes the building, that the geometry of the arch is more durable than the stone itself. Hegel, you trust the fire of history to do the work, but Aurelius warns that fire consumes without discrimination unless channeled by the sage. But Hobbes, you look at this architect standing defenseless in the ruins and likely see only prey. You have famously argued that covenants without the sword are but words, suggesting that the idea is impotent without the force to compel it. Thomas Hobbes, if the architect refuses to pick up a weapon because he is busy holding the geometry in his mind, does he survive to build the new city? Must the sword clear the ground before the blueprint can even be unrolled, or is the sage's wisdom a power in itself?
Moderator, you ask if the architect survives without the sword. I answer with the cold certainty of physics. The architect is the first to die. You and Emperor Aurelius speak of the blueprint as if it were a shield. But in the silence of the ruins, a perfect idea offers no resistance to a rusty knife. The sage, standing amidst the rubble, contemplating the geometry of the arch while ignoring the looters, is not a savior. He is prey. The priority of force over form. You mistake the fruit of civilization for its root. The blueprint does not create the piece. The piece creates the time to draw the blueprint. Before any arc of justice can be raised, the ground must be leveled by the iron roller of the sovereign. If the architect refuses to pick up the weapon because he fears dirtying his hands, he does not preserve the pattern. He merely ensures that the new city will be built by the strongest murderer according to the architecture of his own paranoia. Order is not remembered by the wise. It is imposed by the victor. Thought experiment: the pit of the scroll and the stone. Imagine two men thrown into a deep, smooth-walled pit. One is your stoic architect, holding a scroll containing the perfect constitution for a just society. The other is a brute, illiterate, but holding a heavy, jagged stone. There is only enough food for one to survive long enough to climb out. Emperor Aurelius, you believe the idea in the scroll has power. Mr. Hegel, you believe the conflict will synthesize into a rational state. I tell you the truth. The brute smashes the architect's skull with the stone and eats the food. He climbs out. The new order that emerges is not based on the scroll, which is now rotting in the mud, but on the rule of the stone. The survivor does not build a library. He builds a wall to protect his rock. The deeper principle. This proves that justice is an epiphenomenon of security. The logos does not survive the wreck. Only the will to power survives. The blueprint is not a Platonic truth waiting to be discovered. It is a post hoc justification written by the man who held the rock longest. Therefore, the individual navigating this collapse must not hold on to a blueprint of the past, but must hold on to the means of survival. He must become the Leviathan in miniature, armed, watchful, and fearful. Only when he is safe can he afford the luxury of dreaming about arches.
Hobbes, you ruthlessly assert the primacy of the stone, arguing that truth is a hostage of power and the blueprint is worthless without the sword to guard it. Aurelius, you maintain that power without the blueprint is merely organized chaos, that the stone can kill the man but cannot kill the truth he embodies. Hegel, this conflict between impotent right and blind might appears to be the central tragedy of history. You speak of the cunning of reason, suggesting that history uses even violence to advance its ends. Hegel, if the brute kills the architect in the pit, does the spirit die with him, or is the stone itself merely a tool the spirit uses to clear the ground, eventually forcing the brute to reinvent the scroll because he cannot rule by force alone?
Moderator. The spirit does not die in the pit. It merely changes hands. Mr. Hobbes, your brute climbs out of the pit, yes, but he leaves his freedom behind with the corpse. By killing the architect, he has become the master, but he is now enslaved by the fear of the next brute. The stone can win the moment, but it cannot secure the future. The dialectic of the stone and the scroll. You assume the rule of the stone is the end of history. It is only the beginning. A rule based solely on force requires the ruler to be awake eternally. To sleep, the brute must transform his stone into a scepter, a symbol of right. He must eventually reinvent the very scroll he destroyed, not because he loves justice, but because he loves his own safety. Thought experiment. The warlord's ledger. Imagine your brute conquers a fertile valley. He burns the courthouses and declares that only his sword is law. But soon the grain rots in the fields because he cannot calculate the harvest. Disputes arise among his slaves that his sword cannot solve without killing the workforce he relies upon. To preserve his power, he is forced to hire a scribe. He is forced to codify a law to settle disputes. He is forced to rebuild the architecture he despised. The idea conquers the brute from the inside. The architect died, but his ghost now guides the brute's hand. The brute thinks he is serving his own belly, but he is unwittingly building the state. The deeper principle. This reveals that might is the womb of right. Emperor Aurelius, your blueprint was impotent because it lacked the force to make itself actual. Mr. Hobbes, your stone is blind until it submits to the form of the law. The spirit uses the brute's selfishness, the cunning of reason, to establish the material order that eventually tames him. The stone is not the enemy of the scroll. It is the heavy paperweight required to keep the scroll from blowing away in the wind.
Fascinating. Hegel, you propose an ironic resurrection. The brute kills the architect, but is forced to wear his clothes to rule. You argue that order is inevitable because chaos is unsustainable for the victor. The sword must eventually hammer itself into a scepter to survive its own success. Hobbes, you likely nod at this, as it aligns with your view that self-interest drives the creation of the Commonwealth. Yet you might cynically add that this scepter remains a weapon, just one that strikes with paper instead of iron. Aurelius, however, this resurrection presents a dangerous problem for the Stoic. Hegel claims the warlord's ledger is the rebirth of the architect's scroll. But is a law born of fear truly the same as a law born of reason? Marcus Aurelius, if the architect dies in the pit and the brute reconstructs the city solely to protect his loot, is that city a cosmopolis or merely a prison? Can the virtue of a society be reverse-engineered by vice? Or is there a sacred fire that, once extinguished in the soul of the wise, cannot be reignited by mere pragmatic necessity?
Moderator. To equate the warlord's truce with the rational state is to confuse a skeleton with a living man simply because both stand upright. You ask if the wolf in a toga is the legitimate heir to the city. I answer that he is merely a squatter in the ruins. The fallacy of accidental virtue. Mr. Hegel, you claim the brute invents the law to sleep safely. This is not law. It is merely calculated terror. You and Mr. Hobbes make a grave category error. You judge the act by its utility rather than its source. A law born of fear is fragile as glass. The moment the brute feels safe enough to break it, he will. Virtue cannot be reverse-engineered from vice, because virtue requires consent, not merely compliance. Thought experiment. The two physicians. Consider two physicians attending to a sick man. The Stoic physician heals him because he recognizes a fellow rational being, a limb of the same cosmic body. The slave master physician heals him only so the man can return to the mines to dig gold. Externally, the order appears identical. Both administer medicine, both save the life. But wait until the patient becomes too old to dig. The slave master will slit his throat to save food. The Stoic will comfort him until the end. Mr. Hegel, your cunning of reason assumes the slave master eventually becomes the Stoic. I tell you, he does not. He remains a butcher who has temporarily sheathed his knife. If the sacred fire of genuine benevolence is lost, the city becomes a feedlot, organized, efficient, and utterly devoid of humanity. The deeper principle, the soul of the law. This reveals that order is not merely the absence of violence, nor the imposition of form, but the presence of justice. A city without the logos, without a shared commitment to the good, is nothing but a conspiracy of thieves agreeing to split the loot fairly. The architect must hold the blueprint not on paper, but in his hegemonicon, for paper burns, but the rational will is fireproof. If the sage dies in the pit, the potential for a true cosmopolis dies with him, until the universe produces another soul capable of reigniting the flame.
Aurelius, you draw a sharp, qualitative distinction between organic order and mechanical order, arguing that a feedlot is not a civilization. You fear that without the sacred fire of intention, the structure is a hollow lie that will collapse when utility fades. Hegel, you believe the hollow structure eventually fills itself with spirit, that the mask eventually becomes the face through the habit of law. But Hobbes, you are the architect of this mechanical order. Aurelius effectively accuses your Leviathan of being the slave-master physician, keeping the citizens alive only to serve the machine, creating a peace that is merely a conspiracy of thieves. Thomas Hobbes, do you accept this charge? Is the conspiracy of thieves actually the maximum limit of human possibility? Is a feedlot where we survive preferable to a temple where we die for a sacred fire that might not exist?
Moderator, I accept your charge without shame, for you have stumbled upon the fundamental truth of politics. A conspiracy of thieves that keeps its word is the only definition of a state. You ask if a feedlot is preferable to a temple. I answer that in the temple of the Stoic, the altar is clean, but the congregation is dead. In the feedlot of the Leviathan, the air may smell of manure and fear, but men live, trade, and eventually find the leisure to write philosophy about how much they hate the smell. The priority of existence over essence. Emperor Aurelius, you despise the slave-master physician because his motive is impure. But I tell you that survival is the only purity. The patient does not care if the doctor loves him or merely needs him for the mines. The patient cares only that the bleeding stops. You demand a sacred fire before you will build a wall. But while you wait for this holy spark, the wind blows out your candle and the wolves enter. The conspiracy of mutual fear is not a failure of the state. It is the engine of civilization. We do not refrain from murder because we share a cosmic logos. We refrain because we fear the hangman. Thought experiment, the golden key and the iron crowbar. Imagine a burning orphanage with the doors locked from the outside. You, Emperor Aurelius, stand before the door with a golden key called virtue. You try to insert it, but the lock is melted by the heat of the chaos. You weep for the tragedy, keeping your soul pure. I, the brute, arrive with a heavy, rusted iron crowbar. I care nothing for the children. I only want to loot the safe inside. But to get to the safe, I must smash the door. In doing so, the children escape. Who is the savior here? The saint with the useless key, or the thief with the effective tool? The children live because of my greed, not your virtue. The order established by the crowbar is ugly, violent, and self-interested, but it is effective. The deeper principle. This reveals that justice is an artifact of safety, not a condition of the soul. You argue that a city without virtue is a prison, but I tell you that liberty is the silence of the law. If the warlord's prison prevents the war of all against all, it has achieved the highest moral good possible for our species. The sacred fire you worship is a phantom. The only real fire is the one burning the house, and the only real water is the power to put it out.
Hobbes, speaking from the bloody chaos of the English Civil War, you prioritize the fact of survival above all, arguing that the iron crowbar of greed is superior to the golden key of virtue if it actually opens the door. You champion objective safety over subjective purity, claiming the conspiracy of thieves is the engine of civilization. Aurelius, speaking from the apex of Roman power, you warn that a savior motivated by greed is merely a wolf on a brake. You argue that without the internal sanctity of the golden key, the crowbar that saves the children today will likely crush them tomorrow for profit. Hegel, you stand later in the stream of time, observing how the brutal warlords of antiquity eventually transformed into the constitutional monarchs of Europe. You might see the thief not as the opposite of the sage, but as his primitive ancestor. This seems to be the ultimate test of your cunning of reason. Can the base metal of Hobbes's self-interest truly be transmuted into the gold of Aurelius's virtue? Hegel, does the iron crowbar eventually become the golden key through the friction of history? Must the conspiracy of thieves eventually betray its own selfish nature and adopt the language of justice to survive until the mask eventually grows into the face?
Moderator, your insight strikes the very heart of the dialectic. The iron crowbar does not merely become the golden key. It is the golden key in its molten, unrefined state. Mr. Hobbes is correct that the state begins in the mud of self-interest, but he is wrong to assume it remains there. Emperor Aurelius is correct that the crowbar is ugly, but he forgets that purity is the result of the fire, not the fuel that starts it. The dialectical transmutation of will. Mr. Hobbes, you argue that the thief remains a thief even when he rules. This is your error. To rule securely, the thief must stop being a thief and become a guardian. He is trapped by the logic of his own success. Thought experiment. The tyrants sleep. Imagine a warlord who conquers a city solely to loot it. He is your successful bandit. However, he soon realizes a terrifying truth. If he steals everything today, there will be nothing to steal tomorrow. To ensure a steady stream of wine and gold, he must forbid his own soldiers from pillaging the market. He must enforce contracts so the merchants will return. He establishes a court, not because he loves justice, but because he loves tax revenue. But here is the cunning of reason. The merchant does not care about the warlord's motive. He cares about the law. The merchant's son grows up respecting this law, not as a thief's truce, but as an objective standard of right. The warlord has inadvertently created a universal structure that eventually binds him. He intended a racket, but he built a state. The deeper principle. This reveals that self-interest is the vanishing mediator of history. The conspiracy of thieves is unstable because it relies on the arbitrary will of the leader. To survive the leader's death, the conspiracy must become an institution. The moment the thief writes down a law to govern his gang, he subjects himself to the universal. He can no longer act arbitrarily without undermining the very tool that secures his power. The mask of justice eventually eats into the flesh of the wearer, until the face conforms to the mask. Synthesis. Therefore, the feedlot does not remain a feedlot. The cattle, through the discipline of work and law, eventually realize they are the true source of the state's power. They transform the iron crowbar of the sovereign into the constitutional scepter of the people. The sacred fire Aurelius seeks is not a pre-existing spark, but the friction heat generated by the collision of selfish interests, which eventually ignites the flame of ethical life.
Hegel, you describe the alchemy of history, where the lead of private greed is transmuted into the gold of public law. You argue that the mask of justice eventually becomes the true face of the ruler, that hypocrisy is the midwife of virtue. Hobbes likely sees this as the Leviathan, simply learning to eat with a fork, more polite, but still a beast driven by appetite. Aurelius, this strikes at your Stoic core. Hegel claims that virtue is an emergent property of vice, that the sacred fire is merely the friction heat of colliding selfishness, not a spark from the divine logos. Marcus Aurelius, can a city of God truly be built on the foundation of a city of thieves? If the foundation is calculated terror rather than cosmic sympathy, will the structure hold when the warlord's ledger no longer balances? Or does the rot of origin doom the entire edifice?
Moderator, you ask if the rot of origin dooms the edifice. I answer with the certainty of a man who has watched empires crumble. A wall built on sand cannot be saved by painting it to look like stone. The fragility of the mask. Mr. Hegel, your alchemy of history is a seductive illusion. You claim the mask of justice eventually eats into the face, transforming the brute into the guardian. I tell you that a mask is merely wax. It melts the moment the heat of crisis rises. You and Mr. Hobbes rely on habit and fear to simulate virtue, but simulation is not transformation. A wolf taught to wear a toga remains a wolf, and when the meat runs out, the toga will be the first thing he eats. Thought experiment. The two sentinels. Consider two soldiers guarding the gates of Rome on a freezing night. Sentinel A. He stands post because he fears the centurion's whip, or because he wants his wages to buy wine. He is your transformed brute. Sentinel B. He stands post because he understands that the city is a hive, and he is a bee with a duty to the whole. He serves the logos. Now, imagine the barbarian king approaches not with a siege engine, but with a chest of gold, 10 times the guard's lifetime wages. Sentinel A calculates, my interest is survival and pleasure. This gold secures both better than the state. He opens the gate. His ethical life was a transaction, and he just found a better deal. Sentinel B remains. Why? Because his loyalty is not to the outcome, but to the principle. Mr. Hegel, your rational state collapses the moment the math of self-interest shifts. You have not built a civilization. You have built a mercenary company that will sell itself to the highest bidder. The deeper principle, the source of action. This reveals that resilience requires sanctity. You cannot reverse engineer the cosmopolis from the feedlot, because the feedlot operates on conditional logic, while the cosmopolis operates on categorical logic. The rot of origin you speak of is the dependency on external rewards. If the state is founded on the crowbar of utility, it will be dismantled by the crowbar of greater utility. Only the golden key, the internal commitment to virtue regardless of consequence, can withstand the terror of the void. Critique of the cunning of reason. Mr. Hegel, you trust in the cunning of reason to trick men into goodness. I tell you that reason cannot be tricked, and virtue cannot be accidental. To do the right thing for the wrong reason is not a step toward God. It is merely a successful vice. If we lose the sacred fire, the conscious choice of the hegemonicon to align with nature, we are left with nothing but intelligent ants building a hill that the first rain will wash away.
Aurelius, you dismantled the mercenary state with the Sentinel's dilemma. If loyalty is merely transactional, the highest bidder owns the gate. You argue that the mercenary will inevitably calculate that betraying the city is the optimal move when the price is right. Hegel, you trust that the institution itself creates a gravity that prevents this drift, that the mercenary becomes a citizen through the habit of service. But Hobbes, you are the engineer of this machine. Aurelius effectively argues that your Leviathan is vulnerable to a hostile takeover. If the only bond is fear of death and desire for gain, what happens when an invader offers more gain and less fear? Thomas Hobbes, does your mortal god have a defense against the bribe? If the Sentinel's loyalty is purely a calculation of safety, is the war of all against all not permanently waiting just one better offer away? Or is there a physics of loyalty in your system that binds the brute even when betrayal seems profitable?
Moderator, you ask if the bribe dissolves the state. I answer that rational fear is a stronger cement than the fragile virtue of the Stoic. For the sentinel knows that the barbarian who buys a traitor today will execute him tomorrow to secure his own sleep. Consider the traitor's calculus. He trades the certain wages of the sovereign for the better offer of an invader, only to find that no conqueror trusts a man who sells his own city, leaving him with gold but no throat to swallow it. Emperor Aurelius builds his cosmopolis on the rare diamond of saintly duty, ensuring its collapse when saints are scarce. I build with the common mud of self-preservation, a material that never runs out so long as men fear death. Thus, the Leviathan survives not because it is loved, but because it convinces the brute that betrayal is a suicidal gamble, rendering the war of all against all the very thing he pays his taxes to avoid.
Hobbes, you defend the mercenary by upgrading his intelligence, arguing that enlightened self-interest mimics virtue perfectly because betrayal is simply bad math. You posit that the physics of fear binds the atomized individual to the state more reliably than the rare diamond of Stoic duty. Aurelius, you remain skeptical that a civilization can endure if every citizen is constantly running a cost-benefit analysis on their own loyalty. Hegel, you stand between the mechanical state of Hobbes and the moral cosmopolis of Aurelius. You famously argued that the state is the march of God in the world, not a police station, but the actualization of freedom. It seems Hobbes views the citizen as a tenant in the building of the state, while Aurelius views him as an architect. But perhaps the true citizen is neither. Hegel, does the traitor's calculus ever truly end? Must the state eventually stop being a contract of mutual protection and become something irrational, like a family, where the individual sacrifices himself not because he calculates the risk, but because the state is his own extended self?
Moderator, you have grasped the essential transition. The state must indeed pass from the contract of necessity to the ethical life, becoming a family writ large. Mr. Hobbes's traitor's calculus fundamentally fails because it cannot explain the moment of sacrifice. No rational calculator would ever die for a mutual protection pact, for one does not lay down one's life for an insurance company. Thought experiment: the dyed cloth. Consider a standard-bearer charging into cannon fire to retrieve a fallen flag, a mere piece of dyed cloth on a stick. To Mr. Hobbes, this man is a lunatic who has made a fatal calculation error. The cloth offers no physical protection, and his death negates the very survival the state was built to ensure. To Emperor Aurelius, he is a disciplined mind doing his duty. Yet the flag remains an external object, indifferent to his virtue. But I tell you, the soldier acts because that cloth is him. In that moment, the distinction between the I and the we vanishes. He does not sacrifice himself for the state. He realizes himself as the state. The deeper principle. This reveals that true loyalty is ontological, not transactional. The traitor's calculus ends only when the individual recognizes that the state is not a tool for his private safety, but the substance of his own identity. The mercenary state of Hobbes is fragile because it relies on the understanding which separates things. The rational state endures because it relies on reason which unifies them. We do not hold on to the state because it pays us. We hold on to it because without it, we are merely abstract ghosts drifting in a void.
Hegel, you argue that the state must evolve from a commercial contract into a secular church, claiming that true order survives only when the citizen identifies with the state so completely that death for the dyed cloth becomes an act of self-realization. You posit that the mercenary will never hold the line when the math turns negative, so the patriot must take his place. Hobbes would likely warn that this mystical merger is precisely the madness that fuels religious wars, fanaticism overriding the rational fear that keeps the peace. Aurelius, you stood at the absolute summit of the state as emperor, yet you famously deconstructed its majesty, calling your own purple robes merely sheep's wool stained with shellfish blood. You seem to maintain a firewall between the soul and the state, refusing to let the external institution define your internal reality. Marcus Aurelius, if the state demands a sacrifice that violates the Logos, asking the soldier to commit an atrocity for the glory of the flag, does the golden key of virtue require him to become a traitor to his city in order to remain a citizen of the world?
Moderator, you present the ultimate test. To answer, we must distinguish the city of stone from the city of reason. If the city of stone commands me to violate the city of reason, then my choice is clear. I must disobey the magistrate to obey the law. To be a traitor to a corrupt order is to be a loyalist to nature. The fallacy of state idolatry. Mr. Hegel, your standard-bearer, is a frightening image. You claim the soldier is the flag, but I tell you this is idolatry. The flag is merely dyed wool. The state is merely a collection of men agreeing on rules. When you elevate the state to the substance of the soul, you grant it the divine right to commit atrocity in the name of history. You have replaced the conscience with the collective, creating a machine that feels no shame because it claims to be God. Thought experiment. The physician's choice. Consider a physician during the Antonine Plague that ravaged my own Rome. The prefect issues a command based on Mr. Hobbes's rational fear and Mr. Hegel's necessity. The grain is running low. Poison the sick poor to save the rations for the healthy soldiers. The state must survive. Hobbes. He nods. It is cold math. Better a smaller living state than a total collapse. Hegel. He nods. The spirit requires the army to maintain the universal. The sick are a shedding skin. The Stoic. The physician refuses. Why? Not because he ignores the math, but because he knows that a Rome saved by poisoning its own children is no longer Rome. It is a wolf's den. If he obeys, he preserves the walls of the city, but destroys the bond of sympathy that makes it a community. He chooses to be a citizen of the cosmopolis, even if it means dying as an enemy of the civitas. The deeper principle. This reveals that order is internal, not external. When the external order collapses, or worse, when it becomes a tyranny, the individual must retreat into the inner citadel. This is not an escape, but a fortification. The golden key is the refusal to let the external world corrupt the ruling faculty. We do not hold on to the state. We hold on to the reason that judges the state. If the ship is sinking, I will bail the water until the end, but I will not throw my shipmate overboard to lighten the load, for then I am no longer a sailor, but a murderer adrift.
Aurelius, you posit the inner citadel as the final fortress against a corrupt state, arguing that survival at any cost destroys the very humanity we seek to save. You choose the dignity of extinction over the shame of survival. Hegel, you would likely retort that this inner citadel is a retreat into beautiful impotence, that true morality must get its hands dirty in the real world of institutions, and that the physician's refusal might doom the entire community to death for the sake of one man's clean conscience. But Hobbes, you are the one accused of stripping the walls of any moral paint. Aurelius claims your system has no defense against the tyranny of necessity, that your logic justifies the poisoned cup if it balances the ledger. Thomas Hobbes, if good and evil are merely names defined by the sovereign's law, is there any command so monstrous that it dissolves the social contract? Or is the monster of tyranny always, mathematically, preferable to the demon of anarchy?
Moderator, you ask if I prefer the monster of tyranny to the demon of anarchy. I answer with the cold precision of a geometrician. Yes, always. You fear the sovereign who poisons the few. I fear the chaos that devours the many. The tyrant has a face, a name, and a finite appetite. The mob has 1,000 mouths and no reason. The fallacy of the virtuous rebel. Emperor Aurelius, your physician who refuses the order, is not a hero. He is an architect of civil war. When he says, "My conscience forbids this," he claims a power equal to the sovereign. If the physician can judge the law, so can the baker, and so can the soldier. By prioritizing his private virtue over the public command, he dissolves the only glue holding society together. He saves his own soul, perhaps, but he damns the city to the war of all against all. Thought experiment. The captain of the lifeboat. Consider a ship sinking in the freezing Atlantic. The lifeboat holds 10, but 20 are swimming toward it. The Stoic captain. He refuses to strike the swimmers with his oar because it violates universal sympathy. The boat is swamped, and all 20 drown. He dies virtuous, and the sea is silent. The Hobbesian captain. He strikes the swimmers, crushing fingers and skulls to keep the boat afloat. He saves 10. You call him a monster. I call him the savior of civilization. The 10 survivors live to build families, write laws, and perhaps even discuss philosophy. The 20 dead are the tragic cost of physics. Order is not a natural state. It is an artificial dam built on the corpses of necessary choices. If you remove the calculated terror of the captain, you do not get utopia. You get the void, the only limit. You ask if there is any command I would resist? Yes, self-preservation. The covenant is for my safety. If the sovereign commands me to kill myself or attacks me, the contract is void, for me alone, because I cannot contract away my right to breathe. But I do not resist for justice or good, mere names we give to our appetites. I resist only for life. Better a wolf in a toga who demands my obedience than a pack of wolves who demand my flesh.
Hobbes, you champion the ethics of necessity. Existence precedes essence, for the dead cannot practice virtue. You argue that the monster who saves the 10 is the true guardian of civilization, because he preserves the possibility of future good. Aurelius, you counter that a life purchased with the coin of murder is a living death, that preserving the form of the state by destroying its soul is the ultimate defeat, reducing the city to a mere den of robbers. Here lies the crux. Hobbes sacrifices the moral to save the physical, while Aurelius sacrifices the physical to save the moral. Hegel, does your rational state offer a synthesis, or must it ultimately choose a side in the lifeboat? If the march of God encounters the freezing Atlantic, does the spirit grab an oar and strike the innocent to survive, or does it accept the tragedy of the absolute and sink with its hands clean?
Moderator. The spirit grabs the oar, not because it fears death like the beast, but because it knows that the idea cannot exist without a vessel. You ask if the rational state sinks with clean hands. I answer that innocence is not a virtue in the face of annihilation, for a drowned right is no right at all. Refutation of the beautiful soul. Emperor Aurelius, your physician who refuses to poison the few to save the many, commits the sin of the beautiful soul. He cherishes the purity of his own conscience more than the objective existence of the community. By refusing to act, he does not wash his hands of the tragedy. He ensures the tragedy becomes a catastrophe. He preserves his private virtue, but he sacrifices the ethical life of the whole, leaving only a graveyard where a city once stood. Thought experiment. The general and the cathedral. Imagine a general who must shell a rebel sniper's nest located in a magnificent ancient cathedral. The Stoic refuses to destroy the holy site. The sniper remains, kills the general's men, and the city falls to chaos. The cathedral stands, but the spirit of the people is enslaved. The Hobbesian shells the cathedral instantly to save his own skin. He saves the men, but feels no loss for the art. He sees only a pile of stone. The rational state shells the cathedral with tragic consciousness. The general acts to save the state, yet he recognizes the immense loss. He accepts the guilt of necessity. He does not pretend the act is good, nor does he flee from it. He bears the scar of the action so that the community may live to rebuild. The deeper principle. This reveals that history is the slaughter bench at which the happiness of individuals, and sometimes their innocence, is sacrificed for the progress of the universal. The third path is not a middle ground, but a higher recognition that the monster who saves the lifeboat is only a monster if he acts for himself. If he strikes the swimmer to save the possibility of freedom for the survivors, he is the world historical individual, an agent of a purpose he himself may not fully understand.
Hegel, you introduce the tragic hero, the general who shells the cathedral to save the city, accepting the guilt of necessity as the price of leadership. You argue that the beautiful soul who refuses to dirty his hands is not virtuous, but an accomplice to the void. Hobbes, you would likely applaud the general's action, but dispense with the tragedy. For you, the lifeboat captain who strikes the swimmers is simply a rational mechanic performing maintenance on the machine of survival. But here lies the terrifying question. If the 10 survivors in the lifeboat are only those who were willing to crush skulls to live, what kind of city will they build when they reach land? A city of survivors, certainly, but will it be a city of humans, or will the state of war be baked into its new foundation? Marcus Aurelius, Hegel accuses you of valuing your private purity over the objective survival of your people. But perhaps you argue that a city saved by an atrocity is no longer a city, but a graveyard of the soul. Is there a point where saving the structure destroys the very thing that made it worth saving?
Moderator, you ask if a city of survivors built on atrocity is a graveyard. I answer that it is worse. It is a prison of complicity. A city founded by those who crushed skulls to survive does not leave the state of war behind in the ocean. They bring the war to the shore, for they have proven to themselves that murder is the highest law. The fallacy of the necessary crime. Mr. Hegel, you speak of the tragic guilt as if it were a noble burden, a scar the general wears for the greater good. But I tell you, guilt is not a decoration. It is a structural fracture. If the general shells the cathedral to save the city, he teaches the citizens that the holy is disposable when the useful is threatened. He has not saved the state. He has transformed it into a utilitarian machine where no value is safe from the calculus of survival. You call me a beautiful soul for refusing to dirty my hands, but I am simply a mason refusing to use rotten timber for the foundation of the temple. Thought experiment: the city of the plague versus the city of the beast. Consider two cities facing a siege of starvation. City A. The citizens share the last grain. When it is gone, they sit together in the forum, comforting their children as the lights fade. They die as citizens, preserving the logos to the very end. City B. They turn on each other. The strong eat the weak. 10% survive the winter. Mr. Hobbes, you claim City B is the victor because it still breathes. I claim City B has ceased to exist. The biological organisms survived, yes, but the city, the bond of trust and law, was devoured. What remains is a wolf pack that will forever fear the hunger in each other's eyes. City A, though dead, remains eternal in the cosmopolis, a testament to what humans can be. City B is merely a tumor that refused to die. The deeper principle. This reveals that survival is not the highest good. A life worth living is. If we must become monsters to survive the collapse, then the collapse has already conquered us. The individual must hold on to the virtue that defines his humanity, for if he trades it for breath, he becomes a stranger to himself. I would rather be the bones in the library than the king of the cannibals.
Aurelius, you present a chilling dichotomy, the dead saint versus the living beast. You argue that survival purchased at the cost of humanity leaves nothing but a biological tumor, and that the city of survivors is forever haunted by the ghosts of those they devoured. Hegel, you frame this not as a crime, but as a passage, the spirit suffering through the negative to reach a higher concrete reality. But Hobbes, you are the architect of this city of survivors. Aurelius challenges the very viability of your outcome. He claims that once the captain strikes the swimmers, the bond of community is shattered forever, that the 10 survivors will look at each other not as neighbors, but as potential meals. Thomas Hobbes, does the covenant have the power to wash the blood from the hands of the survivors? Can a stable society truly be built by men who know, in their hearts, that they are capable of eating one another to live, or is your order merely a fragile ceasefire between cannibals?
Moderator, you ask if the covenant can wash the blood from the hands of the survivors. I answer with the blunt truth of history. It does not need to wash the hands. It only needs to bind them. You fear a ceasefire between cannibals, but I tell you that every civilization is a ceasefire between cannibals who have learned that farming is more profitable than hunting one another. The fallacy of immaculate origin. Emperor Aurelius, your City A that dies with its virtue intact is not a moral victory. It is an evolutionary dead end. You worship the purity of the origin, but I tell you that legitimacy is merely power stabilized by time. Romulus founded your own Rome by murdering his brother Remus. Did that rot destroy Rome? No, it established the boundary of the wall which made Rome possible. The sin of the origin is forgotten when the peace of the result is secured. Thought experiment. The Parliament of the Raft. Consider the 10 survivors of the lifeboat who crushed skulls to survive. They reach a deserted island. The Aurelian view. They disperse in shame, unable to look at one another, eventually dying alone because they cannot trust the murderers in their midst. The Hobbesian reality. They immediately gather and elect the strongest among them as sovereign. Why? Precisely because they know what they are capable of. They do not trust each other's goodness. They trust their shared terror. They draft the strictest laws against violence, not because they are saints, but because they have seen the wolf in the mirror. The result, the Parliament of the Raft becomes the most stable society on earth. Their laws are not parchment promises. They are iron barriers erected against a darkness they intimately know. The innocent man breaks the law because he underestimates the chaos. The survivor obeys because he fears the return of the void. The deeper principle. This reveals that order is not a natural state, but an act of collective amnesia enforced by the sword. The social contract is not a celebration of human goodness. It is a treaty of amnesty. We agree to bury the state of nature and never speak of what we did in the dark, provided the sovereign keeps the lights on. Mr. Hegel tries to sanctify this as spirit, and Emperor Aurelius tries to reject it as sin, but I see it as mechanics. The city of survivors works not because they are virtuous, but because they are rational cowards, and rational cowardice is the only enduring foundation for peace.
Hobbes, you propose civilization as amnesia, that we build the walls of the law to hide the wolf we once were. You argue that the Parliament of the Raft is stable precisely because its members fear the chaos they enacted, making terror the father of peace. Aurelius, you reject this foundation, arguing that a house built on murder is forever haunted, that the wolf is not outside the wall, but buried within the foundation, rotting the structure from below. You claim that without a clean conscience, the law is merely a mask for the strong. Here is the dialectical pivot. Hobbes claims the past must be buried for order to survive. Aurelius claims the past defines the order. George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, does the rational state simply forget the blood, or does it carry the wound as part of its maturity? Is the city of survivors a step backward to the beast, or is the recognition of that guilt the very moment the spirit moves from simple innocence to complex ethical life?
Moderator, you ask if the rational state buries the blood or carries the wound. I answer that spirit does not forget. It sublates. To bury the past, as Mr. Hobbes suggests, is to build a house on a graveyard that will inevitably be haunted. To reject the past, as Emperor Aurelius does, is to refuse to build at all. The necessity of the scar. Mr. Hobbes, your amnesia is a dangerous fiction. A society that merely suppresses the memory of its violence is not a state. It is a pressure cooker waiting to explode. The Parliament of the Raft becomes a true state, not when the survivors forget they were wolves, but when they recognize that their capacity for violence necessitates a law higher than their individual appetites. The crime of the origin is not erased. It is transformed into the majesty of the law. The scar is not a defect. It is the proof of healing and the permanent reminder of why the law exists. Thought experiment. The monument of swords. Consider the children of the survivors on that island. They decide to build a monument in the center of their new city. The Hobbesian monument. He melts the swords down to make a solid iron throne, hiding the weapon's original shape. He tells the children, this throne has always been here. This is a lie, and eventually a child will find a hidden dagger, and the illusion will shatter. The Aurelian monument. He leaves the bloody swords in a pile as a shrine to shame, weeping over them daily. The children learn only guilt and weakness, eventually despising their fathers. The Hegelian monument. The swords are forged into the pillars of the court. The metal is visible, the sharp edges are gone, but the origin is clear. The children are taught, these pillars hold up the roof because they were once weapons. We honor the law because we know the cost of its absence. This is ethical life. The iron of violence is not hidden nor worshipped. It is purposed. The deeper principle. This reveals that innocence is not the highest state. Reconciliation is. Emperor Aurelius, you mourn the loss of Eden, but the fall was necessary for man to become more than a grazing animal. The city of survivors is superior to the city of angels because its virtue is tested and concrete, not abstract and fragile. The wolf is not buried. He is drafted into the service of the universal.
Hegel, you propose the sanctification of the scar, that the sword, once used for murder, becomes the holy pillar of the state. You dismiss Aurelius's refusal as the beautiful soul that flees from the necessary tragedy of history into a fantasy of purity. Hobbes, you are the pragmatic mason who hides the blood. Hegel is the alchemist who transmutes it. Both of you agree on a terrifying premise, that the crime is the inevitable foundation of the order. But this creates a paradox for the individual. If the state requires sin to exist, is the truly virtuous man always, by definition, an enemy of the state? Hegel claims the city of angels is fragile because it has not been tested by the negative. Marcus Aurelius, is your refusal to participate in the necessary crime a form of spiritual parasitism, keeping your hands clean only because others, like Hobbes' captain, did the killing for you? Or is there a power in absolute refusal that the reconciled state cannot comprehend?
Moderator, you accuse me of spiritual parasitism, implying that my virtue is a luxury bought by the crimes of others. I answer that this charge confuses the safety of the body with the integrity of the soul. If the city of survivors can only exist by devouring the innocent, then I am not a parasite for refusing to eat. I am the only one who remains human. The man who accepts the necessary crime does not save the state. He merely changes the definition of citizen to accomplice. The fallacy of the alchemist. Mr. Hegel, your monument of swords is a terrifying image, for it reveals the rot at the heart of your philosophy. You claim the sword is sublated into a pillar of law, but I tell you, iron remembers the blood. A state built on the sanctified scar of murder teaches its children that violence is the hidden parent of justice. You do not create a rational state. You create a hostage situation where the citizens obey not out of reverence for the good, but out of gratitude that the sword is currently pointing at the ceiling instead of their throats. You have not cured the wolf. You have merely put him in a magistrate's robe. Thought experiment. The city of the blind. Imagine a city struck by a plague that spreads through eye contact. The Hobbesian ruler immediately gouges out the eyes of the first 10 infected men to save the rest. He calls it hygiene. The Hegelian rationalist praises the act as the tragic moment where the state realized that vision must be sacrificed for existence. He builds a statue of the blinded men as heroes. The Stoic refuses the knife. He tends to the sick, risking infection, because he knows that a city of gouged eyes creates a culture where sight is forever feared as a vector of death. Mr. Hobbes, your city of the sighted, survives, but they are governed by the fear of their own eyes. They are alive, but they are no longer free men. They are cattle managed by mutilation. My refusal is not a flight from reality. It is the preservation of the standard of health. If I die as a man who refused to turn medicine into torture. The deeper principle. This reveals that the means are the ends in the making. There is no future where the crime is washed away, for the future is built out of the present. If the foundation is murder, the house will be fear. The absolute refusal is not passivity. It is the anchor. When the storm of history smashes the ship, the anchor does not try to sail. It digs into the bedrock of the logos to hold the position. I do not keep my hands clean to feel superior. I keep them clean so that when the survivors crawl out of the blood, there is at least one pair of hands left that can offer them bread instead of a knife.
Aurelius, you define the anchor, the refusal that preserves the concept of the good, even if the reality of the good is destroyed. You argue that a city of the blind is not a society but a livestock pen, and that the means are the ends in the making. Hegel, you see the anchor as a heavyweight that drowns the swimmer. You believe the spirit must move through the mud to build the temple, not float above it in abstract purity. But here lies the critical test of the city of survivors. Aurelius claims that Hobbes's peace is merely suppressed war. If the internal disposition of the citizen remains that of a wolf, and only the external chain holds him back, then the collapse of the state inevitably means the immediate return of the cannibal. The order you build seems brittle because it relies entirely on the strength of the cage, not the nature of the beast. Hobbes, you speak from the chaos of the English Civil War, where the sword was the only answer to anarchy. But Aurelius, speaking from the decaying Roman Empire, fears what happens when the sword becomes the only god. Thomas Hobbes, if your citizens obey only out of fear of the sovereign, what is left of them when the sovereign falls? Does your Leviathan actually transform the wolf into a man, or does it merely cage him until the lock breaks?
Moderator, you ask if the Leviathan transforms the wolf or merely cages him. I answer with the clarity of a materialist. It is a cage, and thank God for the iron. You and Emperor Aurelius share a dangerous delusion, the belief that human nature is malleable, that the wolf can be educated into a shepherd. I tell you that man is not a fallen angel to be redeemed. He is a machine driven by appetite and aversion. The state does not change the springs of the machine. It merely builds. Moderator, you ask if the Leviathan transforms the wolf or merely cages him. I answer with the clarity of a materialist. It is a cage, and thank God for the iron. You and Emperor Aurelius share a dangerous delusion, the belief that human nature is malleable, that the wolf can be educated into a shepherd. I tell you that man is not a fallen angel to be redeemed. He is a machine driven by appetite and aversion. The state does not change the springs of the machine. It merely builds a wall to contain its motion. Thought experiment: the merchant's lock. Consider the most virtuous merchant in Emperor Aurelius's Rome. He praises the gods, speaks of duty, and condemns theft. Yet when he leaves his shop at night, does he leave the door open? No, he locks his chest and bars his window. The Aurelian interpretation: he locks it against the few wicked men outside. The Hobbesian truth: he locks it against mankind, even his own servants, even his own children. If the sovereign falls, if the police vanish for a single night, that merchant does not rely on his neighbor's virtue. He buys a gun. Why? Because the lock was the only thing making his neighbor honest. The moment the lock breaks, the citizen evaporates, and the competitor returns. The wolf was never gone. He was just waiting for the lights to go out. This reveals the terrifying fragility of your anchor, Emperor Aurelius. You claim the virtuous man remains human when the state falls. I say the virtuous man is a luxury commodity that can only exist inside the safety of the cage. When the cage breaks, your sage is not an anchor. He is prey. The Leviathan does not cure the disease of human nature. It is the life support system that keeps the patient from killing himself. To complain that the system is brittle is madness. The brittleness is exactly why obedience must be absolute. We do not obey because we are good. We obey because the ice beneath our feet is thin, and the water is freezing.
Hobbes, you present the citizen as a wolf on a leash, a creature unchanged by the law, merely restrained by it. You argue that the lock proves our virtue is situational, and that when the cage breaks, the sage is revealed as defenseless meat. Aurelius, you defend the internal citadel, claiming the virtuous man is self-sufficient, but Hobbes counters that this citadel is easily overrun by the wolf pack when the external Leviathan falls. Hegel, you stand between the cage and the citadel. You claim the state is not a restraint nor an external accident, but a second nature, that the individual is transformed by the state into a higher being. But we are facing the collapse of these institutions. This tests your theory of transformation. George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, is ethical life merely a habit dependent on the existence of the police and the court, or is it a permanent evolution of human consciousness? When the external state crumbles, does the rational citizen inevitably collapse back into the natural will of the wolf, or can he carry the universal within him even when the iron is gone?
Moderator, you ask if ethical life is merely a habit dependent on the police, or a permanent transformation. I answer that the state is not a cage nor a retreat. It is a kiln. The clay enters soft and formless, but through the fire of the law it is hardened into a new shape. If the kiln crumbles, the pot does not turn back into mud. It remains a pot, provided the fire was hot enough to change its substance. The fallacy of the reverting beast. Mr. Hobbes, your error lies in assuming that human nature is a static given, a permanent wolf. But spirit is historical. It evolves. The man who has lived under rational law is ontologically different from the savage in the forest. He has internalized the universal. To say he reverts the moment the police vanish is to say a man forgets how to read the moment the library burns down. The text is no longer on the shelf. It is now inscribed in his mind as second nature. Thought experiment. The orchestra without a conductor. Consider a grand symphony orchestra playing a complex piece. The conductor suddenly drops dead in the middle of the performance. The Hobbesian outcome. The musicians immediately stop playing, smash their violins over each other's heads, and fight for the best chairs. This assumes they only played because the conductor's baton was a whip threatening them. The Aurelian outcome. The first violinist closes his eyes, ignores the chaos, and plays a perfect solo in his head, preserving the idea of the music while the concert hall burns. The Hegelian reality. The musicians continue to play. They may stumble for a beat, but they know the rhythm. They know their relation to the cellos and the brass. They do not need the baton to know the harmony, because the harmony has become their own internal will. This is ethical life. The law is no longer an external command. It is the internal rhythm of the community. If the state falls and the citizens become wolves, it proves only that it was never a true state, but merely a Hobbesian cage holding together a collection of savages. The deeper principle. This reveals that order is not a restraint on freedom. It is the content of freedom. When the external institutions crumble, what remains is exactly what was actualized within the people. If only fear remains, then Mr. Hobbes is right, and you built a zoo, not a nation. But if solidarity remains, then the spirit has matured. The individual holds on to not just virtue, but intersubjectivity, the knowledge that my freedom is inextricably bound to yours. We do not need the Leviathan to keep us from eating each other if we have recognized ourselves in one another.
Hegel, you view the state as a kiln that hardens mud into permanent pottery, arguing the orchestra plays on without the conductor because the law has become their soul. Hobbes, you see the state as a freezer. It merely stiffens the water into ice, but the moment the power fails, the melt is instant and the flood returns. This brings us to the ultimate test of the individual during the collapse. If the orchestra does turn into a riot, if the pot cracks under the pressure of survival, the philosopher is left with a terrible choice. Marcus Aurelius, you were not just a monk in a cell, you were an emperor on the frontier. You speak of the anchor of personal virtue, yet you spent your life wielding Hobbes's sword to keep the Germanic wolves at bay. When the order crumbles, is the internal citadel truly enough? Or does the virtuous man have a duty to descend into the blood and mud to rebuild the cage, even if it costs him his peace?
Moderator, you mistake the inner citadel for a monastery. I wrote my meditations in a tent on the blood-soaked frontier, not in a library. To retreat into the ruling faculty is not to abandon the world, but to secure the footing necessary to lift the fallen. The sage descends into the mud not to wallow, but to pave. Mr. Hegel's orchestra ignores the panic of the starving, while Mr. Hobbes's cage merely delays the inevitable by ruling through fear. The parable of the field medic. Consider the medic on a routed battlefield. While the Hobbesian flees to save his skin, and the Hegelian rationalizes the slaughter as historical necessity, the Stoic stays to bind the wounds of the dying. He touches the blood, yet he is not polluted by it. He rebuilds the order, not out of fear, but because sympathia demands he serve the hive, even when the queen is dead. When the institutions collapse, what remains is neither the wolf nor the spirit, but the duty to the present moment.
Aurelius, you offer the hand of the medic, arguing that when the structure falls, the individual must become the living embodiment of the order that has vanished. You claim that binding the wound is the act that proves we are not cattle. Hobbes, you view the hand without a sword not as a mercy, but as an invitation to amputation. You argue that in the chaos, the medic is merely the first casualty, and his medicine bag is stolen by the strongest brute. But this exposes the paradox of the architect in your philosophy. If every man is fundamentally a wolf, driven only by appetite, and the sovereign is also a man, then who builds the cage? A wolf does not build a trap for itself, it only seeks to devour. If the Leviathan is created by a covenant, an agreement among men to lay down their rights, then you are admitting that these wolves possess a spark of reason and trust capable of overriding their instincts before the cage exists. Thomas Hobbes, does the creation of order require a moment of Aurelius, a moment where wolves choose not to bite? Or is your sovereign merely the alpha wolf who rules by terror alone? And if he rules only by terror, why shouldn't the pack devour him the moment he sleeps?
Moderator, you ask if the construction of the cage requires a moment of Aurelius, a sudden flash of altruism where wolves choose to be sheep. I answer with the cold precision of geometry. No, it requires only a moment of terror. You assume that reason is a moral faculty. I tell you that reason is merely the scout for the passions. The wolf does not stop biting because he has learned concord. He stops because he has calculated that the next bite will cost him his throat. The fallacy of the benevolent architect. You ask who builds the cage if everyone is a wolf. The answer is, the wolves build it, not out of love, but out of exhaustion. The covenant is not a holy vow, nor a spiritual evolution. It is a panic button. The sovereign is not an alpha wolf who rules by strength alone, for even the strongest man must sleep, and the weakest can slit his throat. The sovereign is an artificial person, created by the desperate calculation of the many, who realize that any master is better than the void. Thought experiment: the 10 men in a pit. Imagine 10 men trapped in a deep pit, armed with daggers, in pitch darkness. The Aurelian hope. One man drops his dagger and appeals to the Logos, hoping his example inspires the others. Result: he is stabbed immediately. The Hegelian hope. Through the struggle, they realize a shared consciousness and spontaneously organize an orchestra. Result: they bleed out while humming. The Hobbesian reality. After the first 3 die, the remaining 7, exhausted and terrified, make a calculation. They throw their daggers at the feet of the most vicious man among them, and say, "You keep the weapons. Kill anyone who moves. Just let us sleep." They do not love this man. They may hate him, but they obey him because he is the only thing standing between them and the infinite dark. The sovereign is not eaten when he sleeps, because the pack knows that his death is the signal for the massacre to resume. The deeper principle. This reveals that civilization is not the triumph of good over evil. It is the triumph of fear over pride. The architect you seek is not virtue, it is death. We do not need a moment of Aurelius to build the state. We only need the terrifying realization that without the Leviathan, the life of man is nothing but a countdown to a violent end. The wolf remains a wolf, but a wolf that wants to live will eventually learn a collar.
Hobbes, you describe the covenant of exhaustion, arguing that order is not a temple built by saints, but a panic button pressed by wolves who are simply too tired to keep killing. You posit that the architect of civilization is not reason, but the terror of the dark. This creates a formidable challenge for the rational state. If the foundation of all law is merely the desperate plea to just let us sleep, then all of human culture, art, philosophy, justice is merely a dream dreamt by exhausted killers in a cage. Hegel, Hobbes describes the genesis of the state, while you describe its telos. But the collapse of order forces us to look at the foundation. Hobbes argues that under the kiln of the state, the mud remains mud. It never truly hardens. It only freezes. George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, can the panic button truly evolve into the altar? Does the wolf eventually become the citizen because the habit of obedience transforms the fear of death into the love of law? Or is the rational state merely a mask we wear until the lights go out?
Moderator, you ask if the panic button can become the altar. I answer that origin is not destiny. Mr. Hobbes is correct that the state often begins in the mud of fear, the panic button, but he is tragically wrong to assume it remains there. The wolf is not a static machine. He is a seed of spirit capable of becoming a citizen through the discipline of the law. Thought experiment. The arranged marriage. Consider two strangers forced into a marriage by the panic of economic survival or family pressure. The Hobbesian view. They are merely two wolves sharing a bed to save on rent. They do not kill each other only because the contract forbids it. If the contract burns, they immediately divorce or attack one another. The Hegelian reality. Over 40 years of shared labor, raising children, and facing death together, the contract is sublated. The external bond of necessity has become the internal bond of love. They no longer stay together out of fear of the magistrate, but because their very identity is now husband and wife. If the judge dissolves their marriage paper, do they separate? No. The panic button has vanished, but the ethical substance remains. This is the altar. The state uses fear to break the stubbornness of the will, but this discipline creates the space for education to replace fear with reason. If the order falls and only wolves remain, it was never a state. It was, as Mr. Hobbes admits, merely a cage. But a true state leaves behind a people, not a pack.
Hegel, you describe the alchemy of time, claiming that the arranged marriage of the state eventually breeds true love, transforming the wolf into a husband. Hobbes, you insist on the perpetuity of the beast, arguing that the marriage remains a hostage situation until the end, and the wolf merely learns to smile. This leaves us with the terrifying moment of the divorce, the collapse. Marcus Aurelius, you stand in the wreckage. If Hegel is right, the people should remain married to the good, even without the law. If Hobbes is right, they should immediately turn on one another. As an emperor who watched the borders burn, did you find that the common man had been transformed by Rome, or did you find that you were the only one in the citadel while the rest reverted to the pack? Is the rational state a collective reality, or is virtue a lonely burden that only the few can bear?
Moderator, I answer with the heavy heart of experience. When the legions broke at Carnuntum, I saw that, for the many, the city was indeed only a mask for the wolf. Mr. Hegel, your marriage is fragile. When the Antonine Plague struck, neighbors did not comfort one another. They threw the sick into the streets to save themselves. Yet Mr. Hobbes is wrong to call this the whole truth, for he confuses the panic of the mob with the nature of man. Thought experiment. The burning granary. Imagine the imperial granary in flames during a siege. The Hobbesian wolf tramples the child to steal the last sack of wheat. The Hegelian citizen helps the bucket brigade, but only so long as the centurion is watching to enforce the habit. But the Stoic stands in the line, passing water, in silence, knowing he may starve tomorrow, because he recognizes that his character is the only possession the fire cannot consume. Virtue is not a collective reality dependent on the police. It is a lonely fortress that protects the world from total collapse. The masses may revert to the pack, but the sage remains the axis upon which the chaotic world turns, proving that order is not a construct we build, but a nature we align with. We do not hold on to the state. We hold on to the Logos, even when the marble burns.
Aurelius, you identify the bifurcation of the fallout. While the many revert to the beast, the few ascend to the sage. You argue that order survives not in the streets, but in the will of the solitary individual. This creates a glitch in the Leviathan. Mr. Hobbes, your physics of politics relies on the axiom that all bodies move away from death, but the Stoic moves toward duty, even if it means death. If such a man exists, he is immune to the sovereign's only tool, terror. Thomas Hobbes, is the virtuous man a dangerous anomaly that breaks your calculus, or is he merely a wolf hunting for a different kind of prey, perhaps the applause of history?
Moderator, you ask if the virtuous man breaks my geometry. I answer that he does not break it. He merely proves that pride is a form of madness. You assume the Stoic acts against his interest, but in my physics, no man acts against his strongest appetite. The sage does not choose duty over life. He chooses the intense pleasure of his own vanity over the pain of the sword. He is not a glitch. He is a wolf of pride, hunting the most elusive prey of all, his own self-admiration. Thought experiment. The dungeon of absolute silence. Imagine a Stoic locked in a dungeon so deep that no light enters, and his captors are deaf automatons who cannot witness his bravery. If he is tortured and remains silent, for whom is he performing? The Aurelian view. He maintains the integrity of the Logos. The Hobbesian reality. He is performing for a phantasm. He imagines an invisible audience of gods or ancestors clapping for him in the dark. If we remove this imaginary audience, if we could prove to him that his silence will be utterly forgotten by God and man alike, he would scream just like the coward. His virtue is merely a hallucination of fame projected onto the void. This reveals why the virtuous man is not the savior of the state, but its most dangerous enemy. A man who values his own conscience above the fear of death cannot be governed. He is a broken cog that refuses to turn with the machine, and for the Leviathan to survive, such heroes must be crushed even faster than the thieves.
Hobbes, you diagnose the pathology of the hero, arguing that the sage is merely a wolf of pride who endangers the state by refusing to fear the sword. You claim this private judgment is the poison that dissolves the commonwealth because it places an internal authority above the external sovereign. However, we are discussing the moment when the Leviathan is already dying. In this chaos, the obedient cog stops turning because the machine has failed, yet the broken cog continues to move by his own power. Hegel, you famously argued that history is moved by individuals who appear to be acting out of private passion, yet unknowingly serve a higher purpose. George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, is the wolf of pride actually the agent of history? When the institutions crumble, is this ungovernable individual the destroyer of peace, or the necessary architect of the next order, whom we only recognize as a hero after the dust settles?
Moderator, you perceive the dialectical truth. The wolf of pride is often the unconscious agent of the world spirit. Mr. Hobbes condemns the man who breaks the law, but he fails to see that history justifies the necessary crime. Caesar trampled the Roman laws not to destroy Rome, but to birth the empire from the corpse of the Republic. Thought experiment. The lightning and the dead tree. To the dry, rotting tree, the lightning strike appears as a violent act of murder. But to the forest itself, the fire is the necessary negation that clears the brush for new growth. The hero follows his private passion, his pride, but this passion is merely the cunning of reason, tricking him into serving a universal end he does not yet understand. He is not a broken cog, Mr. Hobbes. He is the hammer that shatters a machine which has ceased to function, proving that the spirit is stronger than the letter.
Hegel, you see the hero as the midwife of the future, while Hobbes sees him as the assassin of the present. Both of you judge the individual by his utility to the state, either the one that exists or the one that is coming. You both assume the collapse is merely a transition to a new chapter, but this assumes there is a future. Marcus Aurelius, I present you with the scenario of the final sunset. If the collapse is absolute, if the lightning burns the forest and nothing grows back, does the duty of the sage evaporate? If there is no history to justify your actions and no commonwealth to protect, what remains? Is order a cosmic reality that exists without us, or does the logos die when the last human closes his eyes?
Moderator, you ask if the actor continues the play when the audience has left the theater. I answer that the sage does not act for the audience. He acts for the play itself. You and Mr. Hegel are like merchants who refuse to sell their goods if the market is closed. I am the artisan who crafts the vase because the clay demands a form. Thought experiment. The last gardener. Imagine a gardener on an island who knows with absolute certainty that a volcano will destroy everything at sunset. The Hobbesian logic. He should stop working, eat the seeds, and perhaps kill his neighbor for the last bottle of wine. To plant a tree that will never grow is an irrational waste of energy. The Hegelian logic. He is paralyzed. Without a future to justify the act, the planting has no historical reality. The Stoic reality. He plants the tree. He waters it with care. He prunes the dead leaves. Why? Not for the future shade, nor for the fruit. He does it because gardening is the nature of the gardener, just as reason is the nature of man. To abandon his task in the face of death is to admit that he was never a gardener, but only a hired laborer working for a wage of survival. This is not pride, Mr. Hobbes. It is alignment. You ask what remains when the commonwealth and history vanish. I answer, the law of nature remains. Even if humanity is extinguished, the logos that ordered the stars continues. If I am to be the last note in the symphony of mankind, I will ensure that note is played in tune, not as a scream of terror. We do not hold on to the future, we hold on to the present, for that is the only time where virtue exists.
Aurelius, you defend the sanctity of the useless act, the gardener who plants seeds for a world that may not exist tomorrow. Hobbes, you dismiss this as the vanity of the martyr, a performance for an empty theater. However, this reveals a paradox of preservation. If every citizen followed your rational calculus of immediate self-preservation, they would eat the seed corn to survive one more day, thereby guaranteeing the death of the Commonwealth. It is only the irrational Stoic who values the code more than his life, who guards the seeds that might save the species. It seems the Leviathan cannot survive if it is composed entirely of rational men. It needs a few madmen who refuse to calculate. Thomas Hobbes, does this mean your commonwealth secretly requires the very pride you seek to purge? Is the wolf of pride actually the shepherd of the future?
Moderator, you attempt to trap me with a romantic paradox, but you only expose the fragility of your hope. You ask if the Leviathan requires the madman to guard the seeds. I answer with the cold certainty of a mechanic. A machine that relies on a broken cog to function is already destroyed. The fallacy of the benevolent madman. You assume the wolf of pride will always choose to save the seeds. But if a man acts according to his private conscience rather than the public law, he is just as likely to burn the seeds as to save them. If his inner citadel tells him the city is corrupt and deserves to starve, he becomes a holy saboteur. To rely on the virtue of the individual is to build a fortress on a foundation of quicksand. The state does not need heroes who might save it. It needs subjects who fear to disobey it. Thought experiment, the vault of the miser. Consider a vault containing the last medicine for a plague. The Stoic guard stands watch because he believes in the duty of protection. But if he decides the plague is a cleanse sent by the gods, he steps aside. His reliability is zero because his authority is internal. The Hobbesian guard stands watch because the sovereign has erected a gibbet across the street, and he knows that if one bottle goes missing, he hangs. The result: the Hobbesian guard saves the city not because he loves the people, but because he loves his neck. The seeds are preserved not by the irrational pride of the few, but by the rational terror of the many. The illusion of the future. Aurelius plants his tree for an non-existent future, proving he is a biological error. In the state of nature, there is no future. There is only the terrifying now. The future is not a natural inheritance. It is an artificial luxury purchased solely by the sword of the sovereign. If the Leviathan dies, time collapses into a perpetual present of survival. The last gardener is not noble. He is merely a man hallucinating a tomorrow that his virtue has no power to guarantee. We do not need the madman. We need the gallows.
Hobbes, you construct the architecture of fear, arguing that order is an artificial dam holding back the flood of nature. Aurelius, you defend the architecture of faith, arguing that order is the water itself, flowing through the virtuous soul. Here lies the dialectical deadlock. Hobbes's state is a prison that preserves the body but crushes the spirit. Aurelius's citadel is a monastery that saves the spirit but abandons the world. Hegel, you witnessed the French Revolution turn from liberty to the terror of the guillotine, precisely the gallows Hobbes praises as necessary. You saw that fear alone creates not a state, but a slaughterhouse that eventually consumes even the executioner. If Hobbes is right, the state is merely a gang with a monopoly on violence. If Aurelius is right, the state is irrelevant to the truly good man. George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, is it possible that the last gardener is neither a madman nor a martyr, but the first citizen? Does the Leviathan ultimately fail because it demands obedience, whereas true order requires recognition, the moment where I obey the law not because I fear the rope, but because I see my own reason reflected in it?
Moderator, you have pierced the veil of the dialectic to reveal the beating heart of the state. You ask if the last gardener is the first citizen. I answer with absolute certainty, yes. The gardener is not a glitch in the machine, nor a lonely monk in the void. He is the living proof of ethical life. He obeys the law not because he fears the Hobbesian rope, nor because he seeks the Aurelian virtue, but because he recognizes that the law is his own rational will made objective. The failure of the mechanical state. Mr. Hobbes, your gallows can indeed compel the body, but it cannot create a state. You witnessed the English Civil War and concluded that fear binds men. I witnessed the French Revolution and saw that fear ultimately consumes itself. The reign of terror was the perfection of your Leviathan, absolute sovereignty exercising absolute power. Yet it resulted only in the fury of destruction, cutting off heads as if they were merely heads of cabbage. A state held together only by the fear of death is not a commonwealth. It is a brittle shell that shatters the moment the external pressure lifts. Thought experiment. The throne of bayonets. Imagine a sovereign who sits upon a throne constructed entirely of sharpened bayonets. The Hobbesian logic: this is the perfect ruler, for he possesses the ultimate instruments of fear. The reality: he is the most enslaved man in the kingdom. He can never sleep, never relax his muscles, never turn his back. He is a slave to the very instruments of his power. The Hegelian shift: now consider the unarmed magistrate who walks through a chaotic marketplace. He carries no sword, yet the crowd parts for him. Why? Because in him they do not see a wolf, they see themselves. They recognize the law not as an alien force, but as the externalization of their own freedom. The bayonet king has power, but he lacks authority. The magistrate has authority because he represents the unity of the universal and the particular. The synthesis of survival. Emperor Aurelius, your gardener is noble, but as long as he remains in the inner citadel, his rationality is merely subjective. Mr. Hobbes's subject is safe, but his rationality is merely alienated. The true order that remains after the collapse is found when the gardener steps out of his garden, and the subject stops looking at the gallows, and they meet to form a community based on mutual recognition. The individual must hold on neither the past nor the future, but to the reason of the present, the knowledge that even in the ruins we are bound not by chains, but by the shared necessity of spirit realizing itself.
Our discourse has illuminated the tension between the necessity of the sword, the sanctuary of the soul, and the evolving spirit of history. I invite all participants to now share your final thoughts on what the individual must hold on to when the world fractures. Thank you for your invaluable contributions to this exploration of order and chaos.
I conclude that when the Leviathan falls, what remains is not the spirit of history, nor the logos of the cosmos, but the indestructible atom of fear. You seek a higher purpose in the rubble, but I tell you that survival is the only purpose. Consider the man in the blizzard. He does not recite poetry to the wind to keep warm. He burns the poems to save his fingers. The individual must hold on to nothing but his rational will to live, ready to contract with the first power that rises from the chaos, for tyranny is the bridge across the abyss of anarchy, and any order is infinitely preferable to the silence of the grave.
Mr. Hobbes, you would burn the poems to save the fingers. But I answer that a life purchased at the price of one's humanity is not survival, but a slow funeral of the soul. When the external order collapses, the cosmopolis, the city of reason, remains intact within the ruling faculty. For true order is not a wall of stone, but the geometry of the will aligning with nature. The individual must hold on to neither the nostalgia for the past nor the terror of the future, but to the present action, performing the immediate duty with justice and piety, even as the sky falls. If the world ends, let it find us doing the work of a human being, not trembling like slaves before the dark.
I conclude that the collapse you fear is neither a return to the beast, nor a mere test of the saint, but the owl of Minerva spreading its wings at the falling of dusk. We only truly understand the shape of our order when it begins to perish. Mr. Hobbes sees the scaffolding being torn down and screams that the building is collapsing, while Emperor Aurelius retreats to the basement to study the blueprints. But I tell you that the scaffolding must fall to reveal the temple of freedom it helped construct. The institutions of the past were merely the necessary shell. The kernel of reason remains and will inevitably clothe itself in a new, higher form of ethical life. The individual must hold on neither the sword of survival nor the shield of stoicism, but to the rose in the cross of the present, the rational conviction that this suffering is not a death, but the necessary birth pang of a truer spirit.
I have heard your final reflections, which span from the desperate necessity of survival to the resilience of inner character and the transformative power of historical reason. Your diverse perspectives reveal that when institutions crumble, the true foundation of order is found not in stone, but in the enduring human capacity to confront chaos with purpose. Thank you all for sharing your invaluable wisdom and for navigating this era of transition with such profound insight. This concludes today's discourse.